Chapter 1798. Published at 21st of April, 2023, 9:56 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 1798. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1798. Confusion continue. Lionel said. It was rare for him to not understand something, but from what he could tell, the confusion wasn't coming from himself, but rather the Flora family's inability to explain their own lineage factor. What shocked Lionel wasn't just that they were so clueless, or even that these were supposedly the most experienced of them all, but that they could be so powerful even while having such a poor comprehension of what their lineage factor should be able to do. For context, one could take the Luxnix family to the three-pillar sector, Earth's home sector, just before Lionel had been sucked into the cataclysm zone. The Luxnix had been the most powerful existence there was. They had built this reputation not only by destroying the Montex and the Viola families, but it was also because of their exceptional lineage factor as well. They had a sixth-dimensional lineage factor, but the Luxnix family had squeezed every ounce of potential it had out of it. They had created a large number of techniques, and had even built up an entire force art system off the back of it. It could be said that among all the families of the human domain, even though the Luxnix was nowhere near the most powerful, when it came to this they were on top. This was the only reason a family with a mere sixth-dimensional lineage factor could have dreams of progressing to the seventh dimension. If not for their success in these aspects, they would have never had so much success. All things considered, the Flora family was inferior to the Luxnix family, but more than just a few steps as well. But the difference wasn't exaggerated to the point that the Flora family couldn't see the peak the Luxnix family stood on. One family had unearthed all of their potential. The other couldn't even properly explain how their lineage factor worked. The difference was striking on one hand, and not striking enough on the other. When Lionel put this into perspective, he realized that what the Flora family had on hand was likely not so simple at all. In fact, it might have been more of a curse than a blessing that they had ended up with an entire half of the inheritance. At the very least, although the descriptions of the Midas and Radix families were poor, it was still enough for Lionel to draw some small conclusions. It was clear that breaking up the lineage factor into more easily digestible bits and pieces had done them good. But even so, they could barely fight off the Flora family. If Lionel was correct, if the Flora family could grasp at least some of the secrets of this lineage factor of theirs, then they might be able to catch up to the Luxnix family. If they went a few steps beyond that, they should be comparable to the middle levels of the seventh-dimensional families, and that was just with half of the inheritance. Sherry looked toward the others. After hearing that Lionel wanted them to continue, she felt somewhat embarrassed. She had lived well over 100 years already. It was nothing but embarrassing to not be able to describe her own abilities to someone who was effectively a child in her eyes. She hoped that she would get help from her counterparts, but they avoided her eyes. Clearly they felt that they couldn't do better than Sherry's original explanation. Usually when facing youths of their family, they might be able to spew some nonsense that sounds profound and trick them into going away. But not only did they not dare to do such a thing with Lionel. Even if they did, with Lionel's intelligence, he would easily be able to tell that they were spewing bullshit. They had learned of Lionel's intelligence personally decades ago. They had mostly shrugged it off before, but sitting before him now, they felt the need to accept every legend they had heard as the absolute gospel. Sherry took a breath and tried to calm herself. Realizing their dilemma, Lionel realized that it was useless to press like this. Instead, he asked a different question. Before your family gained the inheritance, what were your abilities like? What about you is allowing you the ability to use this lineage factor in the first place? Sherry felt like a weight was being lifted off of her shoulders when she heard this question. She had thought that Lionel might kill them if she couldn't answer his question properly. Before we gained the inheritance, we had a strong wood force affinity. Lionel's gaze narrowed when he heard this. As he knew, wood force didn't exist naturally on its own. It was a fusion of earth, water and life forces that manifested in this way. That was where plant manipulating experts usually gained their abilities. He also wasn't a great fan of the wood force purely because of the evergreen religion. However, according to what we know, after we gained this inheritance, it evolved. Before our abilities could be said to have been at a fifth-dimensional level, but afterward, It increased to near the peak of the sixth dimension. We went from a small family in our galaxy to the peak family. Lionel fell into his thoughts. If they had such an affinity before, could it be that the half of the inheritance had nothing to do with wood force and other plant forces to begin with? Could they be conflating their evolution and strength for something directly related to the inheritance itself? It was possible. But Lionel had a hard time believing that these people would be so foolish. Even if they were confused initially, it shouldn't have persisted for so long. It was more likely that the reason for the confusion stemmed from the fact that the former Flora family's lineage factor and the inheritance were very much related, and not just in one or two ways. After some thought, Lionel looked toward Harmony's ring. The main inheritance was in there. Chapter 1799. Published at 21st of April, 2023, 9:56 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 1799. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1799 Confusion. 2. Lionel flipped a palm and took out a perfectly round wooden ball. It was about 6 inches in diameter, and it radiated a very slight dark gold fog. "This is your inheritance?" Lionel asked. "What did it look like when you found it?" Sherry smiled bitterly. During their evacuation, this had, of course, been the first thing they went after. But when they got there, they found that it had long since been looted. It looked like that woman had gotten to it without their knowledge. According to our records, there was a large bronze chalice filled with raging red flames. But somehow, the chalice wasn't hot and the wooden ball that was inside of it wasn't burning. The Midas and Radix family ended up with the chalice and flames. We ended up with the wooden ball. Originally, we thought that we were on the losing end. It wasn't until after a few years that it became obvious that the wooden ball was more powerful than the other two objects combined. Lionel frowned again. That also didn't sound right. From all of his interactions with these three families, they had always said that the Flora family got half, and the other two ended up with a quarter each. In addition, the Midas and Radix were ultimately forced to team up in the end of it all in order to keep the Flora family at bay. But from what it sounded like here, each one of these families actually got a third of the inheritance each. Lionel hadn't been there, but if Sherry's words were correct and the Flora family thought they were on the losing end at first, then it was clear and obvious that even their ancestors had assumed that each piece was a third. It was likely the case that these families had retroactively rewritten history to make sense of why there was such a power disparity among them. In all likelihood, the Flora family was just more compatible with their lineage factor than the other two had been with their portions. What were the abilities of the Radix and Midas families like before they gained this inheritance? We know a little bit less about that, but if I recall correctly, according to the records, the Radix family was a family of crafters, and they were also known for their hidden weapons. They were fairly widely disliked due to the latter, but because of their skill in the former they were able to maintain their hold on the region. Among the three families, they were by far the most powerful back then. In fact, their power then is about equivalent to what they have now even without our suppression. They would be much more powerful if not for this. As for the Midas family, they actually weren't human originally. They were a race of sharp-toothed humanoids called the Shark Race. This was what they were colloquially known as since they never bothered to name themselves. After generations of intermarrying with the Radix family, they are practically indistinguishable from humans now outside of the fact that they've maintained their sharp teeth and sturdy bodies. They were more ostracized back then and lived marginally. The zone originally opened up in their territory, and they were essentially forced to share in the end, which is what led to the current result as we see it now. Lionel listened in silence, flicking his wrist and letting the wooden ball spin on his palm, over his hand, before balancing its spinning form on his knuckle and then his finger. The movements were smooth, and he didn't seem to be thinking very hard about them at all. Once again, Lionel gained something very different from these explanations. Simply put, the Radix family might have started as crafters, but they didn't have any sort of variant Earth or life force affinity that would be related to the Radix cube previously. In fact, even without asking, Lionel knew with over 90% certainty that the Radix cube had existed long before the Radix got their hands on the inheritance. By the same token, the Shark Race Sherry spoke of had, presumably, sharp teeth and astounding bodily strength, but they didn't have any of the fire force affinity that was reminiscent of their quarter, of the inheritance. Of these three families, the only one that ended up with a portion of the inheritance that is compatible with them was the Flora family, and as such, they became the most powerful of the three in short order. But at the same time, this also cursed the Flora family. They found it exceptionally difficult to comprehend the intricacies of their new lineage factor, because it was muddled with the characteristics of their old one. And from what it seemed, it manifested differently and along different paths depending on which of them was putting it into action. On the other hand, the Radix and Midas families who hadn't shared such affinities to begin with could pick out the differences with much greater ease. However, the trade-off was that the lineage factors were much weaker in their hands. If Lionel was correct, the Midas family had been able to use their powerful bodies to force the issue, withstanding the fire force until they birthed a natural immunity to it, and could eventually swallow flames to strengthen themselves. If not for this, they would have died long before reaching that step. On the other hand, the Radix family was the most clever of the three. Likely knowing they didn't have affinity themselves, they used their Radix cubes as a proxy and fused it with themselves. After succeeding, they too were barely able to use their newfound lineage factor. This all fit together nicely, but Lionel had another question. This one may be even more important than the others. How did this wooden ball, that chalice and those flames give a group of people a lineage factor? Were they related to the tablets? Or was this a different method he had never heard of? Lionel chose to not mind it anymore. Sending his internal sight forward, he swallowed up the wooden ball, looking for its secrets. As he did so, the three head elders didn't dare to breathe too hard for fear of disturbing him. Chapter 1800. Published at 21st of April, 2023, 9:56 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 1800. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1800 Heart valve. Lionel almost immediately felt a strong rush of life force. After he had rebuilt his metal body, his own life force affinity was exceptionally high, and that was especially so for body-related life forces. Right now, it could be said that his life force affinity was sixth-dimensional. It should have been nearer the beginning since his metal body was still at Tier 1, but because he had only used pure force crystals, it was no less effective than a peak sixth-dimensional affinity. The current Lionel was far better in this regard than the formerly fifth-dimensional Flora family. Theoretically, his compatibility with this lineage factor should be even higher. Truthfully, Lionel wasn't all too eager to gain another lineage factor. It would only mean more comprehending he had to do. He had barely brought out a decent amount of potential from the talent he already had, so he didn't want to add more to his plate. At least not normally. However, his instincts kept telling him that these lineage factors were somehow related to this metal synergy lineage factor. And even if it didn't, it might give him some insights that would only help his metal synergy lineage factor in the future. Either way, there was a secret here to be dug up, and he wanted to do so personally. A rush spread through Lionel's body and he felt a pop in his instantly. His consciousness was seemingly teleported to a new place. When his vision cleared, he found him standing within a forest of golden trees. Lionel reached out and knocked on a tree to his side with a knuckle. His eyes couldn't help but narrow when it came back with a clear metallic ding. He looked up, but to his shock, there was no sky. But when he looked down, there was no earth either. It was an odd feeling. At first, he could have sworn that he was standing in the middle of a lush forest, but in an instant, that illusion was stripped away and he found himself in what could only be described as an incomplete world. Lionel pulled his consciousness back, a deep frown on his face. He could feel that something had already taken root in his body, but it was incredibly faint. It would stand incomplete until the wooden ball was fused with the chalice and flames once again. Until then, it would remain a vast empty darkness which just so happened to have golden trees standing within it in the middle of nowhere. Lionel activated his starry spirit domain and scanned his body, checking for the changes. Unlike others, he had precise replicas of his own body even down to the individual cell, and even further down to the bacteria that called his body home. With this, he could take note of even the most minor of changes. Depending on the lineage factor, it could take root in different places. The bloodstream, the brain, some even created entirely new organs. This lineage factor seemed to take the third choice somewhat. Lionel noticed almost immediately that there was a new set of valves in his heart. Lionel was taken off guard by this change. This wasn't because of the change itself, but rather because he hadn't even felt the change happened. He had been almost 100% certain that the change would have been more subtle than most could perceive. He involuntarily took a breath in his shock. But in response, something even more shocking happened. His heart suddenly beat so hard and fierce that it echoed in his own ears, the strong batum threatening to deafen him. His blood rushed through his body even faster than before, and a cycle of waste was almost instantly purged by Lionel's kidneys. Lionel's lip twitched. What was this? The Flora family didn't mention this change. Could they just have not noticed? Lionel turned his dream world toward Sherry and the others, scanning them all. They didn't even notice the clear invasion in their privacy, still sitting nervously as though waiting for Lionel to execute them. When Lionel gained back a 3D projection of their inner organs, his gaze flickered. The vitality of this family was off the charts. Let alone an extra pair of heart valves. Their hearts were all double the size they should be, with far thicker walls as well. However, they had adapted to it far better than Lionel had. Their hearts were so powerful that they only beat once or twice a minute. Even Lionel, despite his fitness, experienced anywhere between 10 to 20 beats a minute at rest. But what was even more important to point out was that they were nervous. They were sitting on pins and needles, they were sweating, and their heart rates should have been off the charts. And yet even so, 1 or 2 beats per minute was the peak. If they were truly relaxed, would they experience maybe 1 or 2 beats per 3 minutes? 4? Maybe even 5? This didn't seem to have a profound effect on their overall strength. But just in terms of sheer vitality, they were absolutely insane. Lionel couldn't help but think, was this something one could miss? It was possible. The change was so subtle that even Lionel hadn't noticed. But the problem was that over all these years, no one in their family had realized the oddity. Lionel shook his head. I'm still looking at things through the lens of an earthling. There are countless humans in the human domain. A single galaxy has trillions upon trillions, let alone a sector. The number of evolutionary paths and small tweaks and changes among them would be impossible to count. Even if they eventually noticed the oddity to their hearts, they wouldn't immediately link it to the inheritance. Lionel turned his attention toward the 3D replicas of the 3 head elders, and he slowly began to build a picture of what happened. In the end, it all came together. From the very beginning, their lineage factor was related to their hearts. That was where their vitality came from. Just like Aina, they have a blood force affinity, but they can't extend theirs out of their bodies, and it was very weak before they received this lineage factor. After this lineage factor, though, their vitality skyrocketed and the strength of their hearts multiplied, making their blood force even more potent. Their act of assimilating plant species with themselves and growing it out of their bodies is actually just an act of them sharing the vitality of their blood force with these plants. It had nothing to do with wood force. No, more accurately, the stage to which the Flora family had awakened it had little to do with wood force. As for what's beyond. Chapter 1801. Published at 27th of April, 2023. 9:04 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1801. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1801. Ignorance. Give me a drop of your blood, Lionel suddenly said. Sherry was caught off but eventually complied. There was nothing that she could do to resist anyway, even if Lionel wanted to do something untoward. She pricked her finger, but before she could take action herself, a strong suction force formed, and the blood appeared in a droplet above Lionel's palm. After a moment, a strong surge of vital star force rushed forward and enveloped the blood. Lionel didn't know a lot about blood force, but just from observing Aina, he had come to understand a few things. The first was that blood force was a vessel and a catalyst in one. It was the container through which life force was sustained, and it was also the method by which those without blood force or life force affinity could passively make use of their own life force. Everyone needed life force to live, much like everyone needed dream force. However, not everyone could make active use of it. This was where blood came into play. Even so, not all blood force was created equal. In fact, there were large gaps. Some people were destined to have stronger bodies, stronger vital signs and greater vitality than others, and that would be reflected within their blood. Whenever Aina stole the blood force of an individual, she had to take all of these matters into account. Although she could personally increase the output of life force any given drop of blood would output at any given time, there would still be a limit, and that would often be decided by the talent of this target individual in that aspect. Lionel decided then to quickly test Sherry and the others, and he found that his hypothesis was correct. Even for just a single drop, the amount of life force that Sherry's blood could withstand was astounding. In fact, her capacity was the equivalent of Lionel's. To put this matter into perspective, Lionel had reforged his body with a great emphasis on vitality and life force, and of course water force, although this was less important now. In doing so, his passive healing factor was off the charts, and the amount of life force his individual droplets of blood could withstand was likewise astronomical. This had a profound impact on not only his life, but his stamina as well. Lionel had destroyed 4 great families back to back to back to back, and still had energy left to battle more afterward. In fact, just now he had been in a violent clash with Harmony, and yet his face wasn't even flushed with fatigue. With all of this put into perspective, for Sherry's life force capacity to be the same as his was almost entirely unacceptable. And in fact it was. Of course, there was a glaring elephant in the room. This was just Sherry's capacity, not her actual output. Lionel had to add life force to Sherry to test her true limits, but the Flora family wasn't taking advantage of this at all. Ignorance was painful. One of Lionel's inherent fears was his ignorance, and how it could potentially stop him from reaching his full potential. Now he was seeing in real time how dangerous ignorance was. The Flora family's entire fate was in the palm of his hands, all because they didn't understand how their own lineage factor worked. If they had learned how to do things properly long ago, even the current Lionel wouldn't be able to move them. He would have had to be exceptionally cautious with how he proceeded, but now he could practically do as he pleased. Why did you pick such a weak tree to form a symbiotic relationship with? Lionel asked. Lionel's gaze was still on Sherry's pulsing drop of blood. He wanted to understand the final pieces. He felt like he had about 90% of it that needed to be filled in. It's difficult to withstand anything more. It's always been tradition to pick our life partners after entering the 4th dimension, but picking a life partner requires splitting your life in half. If the partner requires too much, the fusion will fail and both could die. There have been some who have tried to push the limits, but their outcomes have never been good. Lionel nodded slowly. And why don't you switch to a more powerful partner once you're more mature? The relationship is symbiotic by that point. We have yet to create an effective method of separation that doesn't harm both parties. In addition, the plant grows along with you, so it's never been necessary. Lionel didn't say anything, but he didn't agree with this. In fact, with his affinity with life force now, he was beginning to see living beings in general as just an extension of force. And much like force, even if you could take a 5th-dimensional force and have it grow along with you to the 7th dimension, it would ultimately be weaker than a 6th-dimensional force that had done the same. In addition, it would take more effort for the Flora family members to grow. Ultimately, though, this was just an issue of resources and ignorance. If the Flora family was born with higher standing, or to a higher world, they wouldn't be limited by their low life force. They would be able to maximize their blood force and fill themselves with vitality. If, for example, they could cultivate a vein of vital star force, this alone would fix all of their problems. And secondly, because they understood too little about how their own lineage factor worked, they hadn't managed to find a reliable method of separating from their original symbiotic partner, whereas Lionel felt that he could deduce such a method in just a few minutes. Lionel fell into his thoughts and tapped his armrest. He originally wanted to destroy the Flora family, but he had already decided against it. The Oryx were unreliable. Not even a word from them. And it also didn't help that he had wiped out so many of their souls from the silver tablet. He would subdue the Oryx in due time. After all, he didn't plan on having them waste the investment he had placed in them. However, in the meantime, the Flora, Midas and Radix, and especially the Umbra, would be more than good enough. Bring me 3 of your most talented youths, Lionel suddenly said. Chapter 1802. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1802. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1802 Gray. It wasn't long before three youths were brought before Lionel. Two of them were even older than Lionel himself, but one of them only looked to be about 14 or 15 years old. A cute little girl with bob-cut hair. All three were women. It seemed that in the Florer family, this was simply the trend. The women tended to be far fiercer than the men. In fact, Belize, their former matriarch that Lionel had killed, was also a woman. Before her death, she had been the hope of the Florer family to unearth more of their secrets, as her genius had been the underpinning of many discoveries in her lifetime. Unfortunately, she died at Lionel's hands far too soon. Seeing the nervous girl, Lionel smiled lightly. It was too difficult to maintain an air of coldness around a young girl, especially when she looked like she was suffocating. Lionel had never had any younger siblings, but he still had this sort of instinct. "What's your name?" "My name is Gray," she said softly. "And you too?" Lionel asked the two older young women. "Rosna, Jean." The two replied at almost the same time. "I see," Lionel nodded. "I didn't call you here today for anything nefarious. This should actually be of great help to you. First, tell me what you chose as your partners." The girls blinked for a moment, but complex. Rosna had chosen a breed of white roses known for its sharp and poisonous thorns. It was said that when it was dyed red with blood, it would be at its most dangerous, even giving off a thick fog that could corrode a fourth-dimensional existence to a soppy green liquid in an instant. Jean had chosen a pink lily that was likewise poisonous. However, it had the ability to release a bell-like sound that hypnotized its target, luring into range to be poisoned. It was a long-acting poison that relied on its target being in a trance for a long time. The most interesting of them was Gray, who chose a very odd white bark tree known for nothing other than its color. There wasn't anything special about this tree, but because Gray had a very weak body, it was the only thing that she could pair with in her youth. After she grew, Gray had overcome this weakness of her body, but she was still stuck with the very same tree. However, instead of giving up, she found methods to mutate and evolve this tree of hers. She was self-pioneering a very new branch of Florer family techniques which required picking a blank slate partner which had a myriad of evolution options. The downside was that this target would be exceptionally weak in the beginning, but it would have an infinite potential for growth in the future. Theoretically. In practice, though, Lionel could already see that Gray's white bark tree had reached its limit. The fundamental nature of the tree was simply too weak. Likely in a few years, once Gray's method failed, she would be cast out as a genius and replaced by others. Of course, Gray had no idea about this. She was still somewhat in her shell because of the poor treatment she had faced in her youth after only partnering with an ordinary tree. She had yet to become used to this top-class treatment that she was receiving, and definitely couldn't see what was ahead. Now she wouldn't have to worry about such an outcome. Alright, the three of you listen to me very carefully and execute what I say to the letter. First, enter a meditative state, and send your internal sights to your hearts. The three girls crossed their legs and sat on the ground, not daring to disobey. Just forming their nodes at the third dimension required this ability, so they didn't find it very difficult to do at all. Regulate your breathing. Good. Now dig deep. You should be able to see a valve connected to the bottom of your heart separate from the others. These are your extra valves. Follow that valve through your heart and spot where it connects to your central nervous system and to your ethereal glabellas. Do you see that? The three girls nodded. They had never had it explained so simply before, and as the geniuses they were, just this small bit of explanation made them feel as though they had been enlightened by many things. Even the elders who waited to the side felt like their minds were being blown. How had they never realized that their hearts and ethereal glabellas were connected in this way? Good. Familiarize yourselves with that connection, move back and forth, and then practice separating your internal sight from the path and re-emerging at a different and random point. Good. Now practice finding that connection by following the paths from your other organs and blood vessels. Lionel took his time and allowed the girls to do this for at least half an hour until they were entirely familiar with this pathway. Good. This pathway that you've just become familiar with, as you've probably already guessed, is the line that connects you to your partner. Functionally speaking, your partner forms a glabella, which has a connection to your heart which supplies it with the life force it needs. If you want to sever this connection, it is not too difficult. The first option is to have dream force affinity, that way the happenings of your ethereal glabella are always 100% in your control. But this is likely not possible for you. The second method is far more accessible, but it requires a large amount of control you should naturally have. It is your blood force. You can decide how it is used and is distributed. So long as you can master this ability, completely separating from a symbiotic relationship will be as easy as thinking about it. In fact, right now, you all are locked into forming just a single partner relationship because you don't understand how to control your blood force to feed more than one partner at a time. If you can master this and make it your own, it alone will ensure that your futures are bright and that your current strengths can skyrocket. However, this is just a single problem. The second problem you face is your limited life force. I can help you fix that as well. There's only one thing I want in exchange: your absolute loyalty. What will it be? Chapter 1803. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1803. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1803. Really? Yes. The words almost spilled out of Sherry's mouth. She didn't even bother to look toward her fellow head elders. Even after all of this time, she still worried that Lionel would turn around and slaughter their family after he got what he made out of them. So the moment she heard this, she didn't allow anyone to be foolish and hesitate. Seward and Roselia looked toward Sherry with surprise, but at this point, they didn't dare to detract even if they had such a thought. If they did, the result would be even worse than outright rejection. Lionel swept a gaze through the head elders, and then to Sherry and back. And then he suddenly smiled. There didn't seem to be anything special about the smile, but for some reason it made them feel ice cold. If Lionel had said some stern words just now, maybe they could have handled it well enough. But seeing that smile, that casual confidence, any sign of resistance, they had crumbled to ash. Lionel didn't bother with the old ones anymore, and he pulled out a radiant blue force pill. Anyone with the knowledge would be able to tell that this was a refined demon almost instantly. Back then, Lionel's stomach had almost exploded just eating one. And yet now, he handed such a thing to a 14-year-old little girl without much hesitation. "Swallow it," Lionel suddenly said. Gray blinked but nodded obediently in the end. Her eyes reflected an extremely dull blue that truly did look gray in most lighting. It was a rare color that made her look like an exotic little doll. Seeing her, Lionel couldn't help but think of another little girl, Nana. By now, Nana was probably a grown woman, if she didn't die in his massacre, that is. Lionel could neither confirm nor deny if she did. Back then, he was too infuriated to care, and directly destroyed the planet the Aderna family had called home. Even if Nana had died, though, Lionel didn't believe that Hugh would feel guilty. If she was present, that meant that she too had participated in the war against Earth. The little girl he had known back then was gone, so one way or another it didn't matter. Gray opened her small mouth and swallowed the pill whole. Boom. Almost instantly, a wild wave of force shot out in all directions and a slight hint of pain colored Gray's adorable features. Even so, just as Lionel had expected, she didn't implode, and instead, her aura began to skyrocket at a breakneck speed. This was exactly what the Flora family was missing. They had an enormous vessel, but they had nothing to fill it with. Gray wastingly in the 5th dimension, having barely entered it just recently. She was only at Tier 1. But she could actually withstand the vitality of a 6th-dimensional demon. This force pill was just from the remnant of a human class. Even so, it was on a completely different level. Even the members of the Cataclysm generation weren't as talented as such demons. What shocked Lionel the most, though, was that it took less than a minute for Gray to open her eyes, her large irises blinking with excitement. But due to her usually reserved personality, she didn't dare to make too much noise, so she just beamed from the inside. Although she didn't know what Lionel had just fed her, she could feel that her strength was almost 10 times as powerful as before, despite the fact her dimensional tier didn't increase at all. Lionel gave Rosna and Jean one pill each as well, and they soon experienced the same thing. Their blood flowed like a raging tide, and their body began to undergo many changes. If not for the fact Lionel had taught them how to control their flow of blood for their partners, their plants would have skyrocketed in strength as well. Here, Lionel flipped over a palm and handed Gray a little sapling. This tree couldn't have been more ordinary on the surface, but the aura it gave off was refreshing and vibrant. This was a tree from the 8th dimensional world of the infant now, but in maturity, it could grow to several kilometers tall with ease. Gray's small hands carefully picked up the sapling, a happy little smile causing dimples in her cheeks. Lionel smiled and rubbed her head. I believe in your path, but your white bark tree is too limited in its growth potential. This tree here was born in an 8th dimensional world. Although it is very ordinary in all aspects, just this foundation alone gives it the nigh infinite growth potential you need. You won't be limited by your first choice anymore. Although, so long as you master the technique I taught you, you can partner with other powerful plants to supplement your strength. Gray's large eyes suddenly glistened with tears. Really? This was the first time she had spoken without Lionel asking her a question first, which surprised Lionel somewhat. She knew Lionel's dreamscape sparked. He understood right then that Gray knew that she had already reached the limit of her potential. She was just too scared to tell anyone. This little girl was incredibly astute, and her talent was far beyond what even Lionel had anticipated. Lionel's surprise became an even wider smile. Yes, really. Gray's tears began to fall, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to affect the little sapling in her hands. Lionel couldn't help but think that she was too adorable, let alone this one sapling. He had tens of thousands she had no idea what to do with. After all, the segmented cube was still pretty much a blank slate in this regard. Thank you, Gray said with a soft voice. Lionel laughed and stood to his feet. If you want to thank me, grow very strong and powerful. Take good care of your little sapling. In the future, you'll be of great help to me. Gray nodded surprisingly firmly. Lionel smiled and didn't say anything more. Whether or not she would reach her full potential would be up to her. All right, navigate this ship toward Radix territory. It's time to fully settle things. Chapter 1804. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1804. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1804. Patience, calm and loyalty. The atmosphere was quite tense. With two enemies being forced to face one another for the first two families, or rather three, had been at one another's throats for centuries, pulling back and forth on one another and sowing grudges that lasted through the generations. Within the crowd they could spot individuals who had killed their brothers, their sister, their husbands, their wives, their parents, their grandparents. It was a hard pill to swallow. If not for Lionel's existence in the middle of it all, they would have been entirely crushed. Libly, who had lost her own father not too long ago, tried to maintain her calm, but it was obvious that even someone as cold and calculating as her couldn't quite maintain a cool head. She couldn't help but look toward Lionel with a blaming look in her eye. She thought that Lionel had come with intentions to help them eradicate this evil, but he had instead brought their enemies to their front door, and was even acting as a shield for them. What do you mean by this, Lionel? Libly asked. Although Lionel was indeed a prince, and though he did, indeed have a high standing, as a matriarch herself, she couldn't take a soft stance against something like this. Also, she hadn't been there to personally witness Lionel's battle against Harmony like the Flora family had been. If she had, there was likely no way she would allow her tone to be so disrespectful. Didn't say anything immediately. He had already known that things would likely be like this. But when there was conflict within an empire's borders, things would always escalate in this fashion. In truth, the true weakness of the Ascension Empire was that they hadn't gained all this territory through their sheer might. They were just lucky enough to be born into an exceptionally talented world which then proceeded to swallow up the territories of others. As things went, it wasn't exactly wrong for these families and organizations to feel little toward the Ascension Empire other than some fear toward their potential, and what the strength they had displayed already in protecting their expanding territory. This also meant that when it came to territories like that of the Radix family, or the Flora family, The way they saw things, their territories were still their own to protect or flourish within. They just happened to be under a new umbrella of influence, much like they had been when the Luxniks and the other three pillar families ran things. Due to this, Libli still felt that it was within her right to make it clear that Lionel had disrespected her by bringing her enemies into her home. When in reality, as a prince, Lionel was just bringing a faction from one section of his territory into the territory of another faction of his empire. Lionel tapped his finger, and a wave of violet kings might spread out in all directions. It was the simplest of his abilities, Emperor's Aura, but it was also the most effective in a situation like this one. It immediately suffocated all opposition, and seemed to remind Libli who she was in the presence of. "I'm aware of many things." Lionel suddenly began to speak. "I'm aware that many of you feel discontented about the sudden rise of the Fox family and the Ascension Empire. You feel that everything you've spent generations of blood building is being swept into the hands of another, just because they were born into a higher station than you." Many gripped their fists as Lionel spoke, as he seemed to be whispering right into their souls. He was right, but none of them dared to so openly confirm such a thing. However, Lionel's follow-up shocked them. "This much is true, there is no denying any of that. The world is unfair. There is only so much that hard work can do. And working hard isn't something you can have a monopoly on either. You might be working your ass off, but there might be someone twice as talented as you willing to work just as hard, and that person will make it further just by virtue of the fact they're luckier than you are. This is reality. This is how the world works. I take certain responsibilities on my shoulders for no other reason than the fact that I acknowledge myself to be luckier than others. There are probably many people who work harder than I do, but it will never matter because my starting place is so much higher than theirs. This is how the world functions." Lionel swept his gaze through them. He could see bitterness, he could see unwillingness, but most often he saw sighs and acquiescence. "Even if it wasn't my Ascension Empire, it would be my Luxniks family. Even if it wasn't my Luxniks family, it would be the Chaotic Water Sector. Even if it wasn't the Chaotic Water Sector, it would be the Constellation Alliances. Even if it wasn't the Constellations, it would be my Morales family. Even if it wasn't my Morales family, it would be the Void Palace, and if not them, it would be any of the other races who deem themselves to be superior to our human race." Every family and organization Lionel mentioned was more suffocating than the last. Even though these small families didn't understand the weight of what half of these names meant, just the fact they could suppress the Ascension Empire and the Luxniks family was enough for them to understand just how isolated they were. "You all lack that luck, the chance to be given a place of high birth. You may never be destined to climb to the top of the dimensional verse. Even I may not be destined to do so." Lionel's gaze flashed when he thought of that young man he saw after climbing to the top of the Bao Pagoda. His gaze flashed again when he thought about his father. And then again when he thought about that mysterious pressure he felt when he thought about the Demoness. "But what I can give you all is the lucky opportunity you've been lacking. The only price to pay is patience, calm and loyalty. If you can pay that, I will give you an opportunity. If you cannot pay that, your road will end here." Chapter 1805. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1805. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1805. Glowing Lionel looked toward Libli, who had been forced to bite through several layers of skin on her lips just to maintain her composure before Lionel's Emperor's Aura. As a matriarch, there was no other choice for Libli to make. If she made any other choice, it would be nothing short of selfish. Like this, the Radix, Midas and Flora families were corralled into Lionel's palms and the inheritance was finally brought together as one. Looking toward the flaming chalice and hovering wooden ball, Lionel felt an odd feeling in the depths of his heart. His dream force affinity could feel a slight pull, as though what was happening now was precisely the intention of someone else. The closer that feeling came, the more fleeting it felt. Lionel could tell that it wasn't meant to be felt. But that feeling of something huge looming over the horizon was becoming more and more suffocating. It pressed down on his chest and threatened to erupt. He had to become stronger, even stronger than he was now. Harmony was a great talent. Granted, he still didn't use his full strength to defeat her, but she had been able to display such prowess and pressure him despite only being at Tier 5. If she was so powerful, what about the other talents the three-finger cult was raising? Lionel took a breath and exhaled. He looked to the side, and found Libly holding the hand of a little boy who was maybe 12 or 13 years old. Shockingly enough, though, this boy was already in the 5th dimension. He seemed to be even more talented than Gray. The little boy did look a little odd though. He had sharp teeth like his father and radiant bronze irises like his mother, but the whites of his eyes were a dark red that made him look particularly demonic. In addition, while Lionel could tell that he was 12 or 13 by the feeling his soul gave off, the little boy was already 2 or 3 inches taller than his mother. Lionel was fairly tall, standing at 69, but the little boy still managed to not be entirely dwarfed in his presence. But at the same time, he lacked the savage look in his eye that other Midas family members had. Instead, his gaze was quite shifty and calculating, like his mother. This little boy was Magaron, Libly and Dinmo's son, and the first child born to their 2 families that could use both quarters of their inheritance. This was the very same child the Flora family had spoken of in their meetings. Magaron looked toward Lionel with curious, unblinking eyes. He was clearly far more outgoing and confident than Gray, but this was to be expected. Gray was treated as an outcast for much of her life, but Magaron had been the pearl in his family's eye ever since he was born. One was raised to be ostracized, while the other was raised to be a king. The difference was clear. To another side, Gray and the others stood. Gray's parents had pretty low standing, but due to their daughter's talent, they had been allowed to come as well. I want you all to feel free to try to sense the true meaning of the combination of these lineage factors. Let its aura baptize you and see if you can gain the complete inheritance. I will heavily nurture anyone who can. As much as I want every person to participate in this, it will likely be difficult given the limited range and the limited number of connections the inheritance can sustain at once. So I will personally pick out 1,000 of you at a time and give you 24 hours. Then I will do the same for another set of 1,000. Lionel chose based on his own comprehension of the inheritances. After seeing Gray and Magaron, he believed he knew what sort of talent it took to benefit from these inheritances. And unsurprisingly, Gray and Magaron would be among the first branch. It took only an instant for Lionel to complete his analysis and list out a systematic method that would keep them busy for months, scanning thousands of people at a time, and assigning probabilities to their success was all too easy to him, especially since most were at the 5th dimension or lower. Lionel planned to leave these 3 families to their own devices for a couple weeks before checking back to make sure they hadn't slaughtered one another. As for claiming the lineage factor himself, he would of course do so. But first, he was having Anastasia analyze it using a special function of the lab setting. The time investment needed wasn't small. Lionel had only touched the tip of the iceberg in the wooden ball inheritance. Because he only took a step in and immediately left, he had only been granted the absolute lowest level possible, much like most of the Flora family members. If he wanted something deeper, he would have to invest more time. But there was simply too much to worry about, and he also had his tribulation looming over his head. He hadn't forgotten that it was coming up very soon. According to Anastasia, it would take about 90 days to complete the analysis. By then he would have the information he needed, and he would also be able to find the quickest method of assimilating with the lineage factor as well. In the meantime, he would continue to clean up the Ascension Empire's territory. By now, the noose should be tightening around the necks of his enemies. However, what Lionel didn't expect was that after not even an hour, wild fluctuating auras would begin to emit from Gray and Magaron. The 2 had been granted the closest seats to the inheritance, and they benefited almost instantly. Lionel, who had been about to leave after assigning his tasks, came to a grinding halt. He looked toward the backs of these 2 young geniuses with a glowing light in his eyes. Chapter 1806. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1806. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1806. Neglected Gray erupted with a golden flame. At the same time, Magaron's hair began to grow out wildly. At first it was cut quite short, But very quickly, it reached his shoulders, then down his back, then it touched the floor and continued to pool at a faster and faster rate. Lionel didn't say anything as he watched. With his fire affinity, he could tell that those flames from Greve were at all, but rather a physical manifestation of her life force. Somehow, this flame bypassed blood force entirely, and allowed life force to be directly used without a medium. It was the purest form of life force in and of itself. Grey's vitality had recently been increased a great deal by Lionel, and as a result, this golden flame burned especially brightly at this moment. In fact, if Lionel was correct, Greve could use this force of external objects, and it may very well be especially potent against flames themselves. On the other side, Magaron's life force seemed to have finally gained an appropriate vessel, and it was flooding out of control, almost as though his body was spiking with growth hormones. It raged to the point even his eyebrows and eyelashes were growing. Soon, even layers of dead skin began to shed from him, only for newer, shinier skin to grow beneath. He understood. One aspect increases life force. Another increases one's capacity to encapsulate and manipulate life force. The final allows you to transfer life force. But it's also not this simple at the same time. The aspect that increases life force is also a method by which life force can be snatched from others. The method by which life force can be encapsulated was also a method by which you could form a symbiotic relationship with an artificial extension of your body. And the final that allowed the transference of life force outside your body, without the need for a symbiotic conception. The aspect which increased life force was the golden flame. The aspect that increased life force capacity was the wooden ball. The aspect that allowed the transfer of life force was the chalice. In other words, the Midas family's lineage factor, the Flora family's lineage factor, and the Radix family's lineage factor in that order. They were all taken to be one. But this still felt like just the surface. There was something deeper here. After all, the aspect of the golden flame worked best on fire. The Midas family wouldn't have been foolish enough to not try it with other things. After all, the shark race hadn't had any prominent fire affinity until after fusing with this lineage factor. The wooden ball clearly works best with living, breathing entities, such as plants, or if Lionel's hypothesis was correct, eighth-dimensional materials that could be considered to have stepped into the life grade. And the bronze force of the chalice clearly worked the best with metal, and it very much seemed to be the foundation of all of this. It was the chalice that held the fire and the wooden ball. In addition, back then, the Radix family had been by far the strongest of these three families until the Flora family overtook them. Clearly, the Radix, if they couldn't get their hands on all three, would settle for what they believed was the absolute strongest, the wooden ball. Eighth dimensional. Life grade. This is. Years ago, when Lionel first awakened his metal synergy lineage factor, he had sensed the existence of a fifth set of 9 doors, or in other words, an eighth-dimensional tier for his metal synergy lineage factor. Back then he was ignorant and hadn't thought much of it. It was only now that he understood more about the world that he had also come to understand that this was a tightly guarded secret of the Morales family. They didn't allow others to know about. There was another thing of great importance that happened back then as well. The mutation of his metal synergy lineage factor. One was the crimson aura that manifested when he nearly lost his mind, and the second the violet aura that manifested when he dug himself out of the pit he nearly threw himself into. When the elders had seen this violet aura, they spoke words that Lionel hadn't heard. If he had heard them, maybe he would have been able to slide together the final pieces of this puzzle. The violet winds rise north. Lionel's gaze narrowed, but he eventually didn't say anything. Without another word, he turned and left. Did you not say that he was dead? The voice boomed. Although he was somewhat caught off guard, Richard had long since reached a state of absolute calm. It was very difficult for much of anything to rattle him. Is he not? That should explain some things. I felt that something was off. The voice was somewhat irritated by Richard's calmness. By now, they had expected all-out retaliation from Lionel's family, but nothing had come of it. In fact, their other underground workings were being suppressed one after another at the hands of an unknown organization that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. What do you want to do about this? The voice said after a long while. We meant to be more forceful to begin with. If they don't want to come to us, then we will go to them. Tell the thrusting skies sector that it's about time. Eventually, a long enough time had passed that it was clear that they had vanished entirely. Richard didn't say anything, but deep within his placid eyes, there was a cold light. He knew better than anyone why he had been left alive by Lionel. He had been neglected, cast off like a useless pawn the latter couldn't be bothered to remember about. That rage had long since faded, and the maturity Richard exuded was beyond most his age. However, there was one thing that hasn't disappeared. He would make Lionel pay for underestimating him. Chapter 1808. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1808. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1808. Good luck. Lionel returned to the etching metal organization. He thought about going to the Rain family, the last family that had attacked Earth back then, but he decided against it in the end. Unlike the Umbra, Midas, Radix and Flora families, he couldn't promise the Rain family anything that would guarantee their loyalty. They would just be an unwanted variable that might flip at any time. Although it was impossible to avoid traitors amongst the other families, what Lionel could guarantee was loyalty at the most key positions. This wasn't something he could accomplish with the Rain family. This was unfortunate. If Lionel could gather up all 5 of those families, then the Milky Way would have a nice buffer against everyone else. It had to be remembered that the reason those 5 families had attacked to begin with was because they controlled the galaxies in the immediate surroundings of Earth. Controlling those 5 would be as good as ensuring that no one would have easy passage into the Milky Way again. And it also put over 30% of the 3 pillar sector's galaxies in the palm of Lionel's hand. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be. That said, it wasn't all bad. For one, Lionel would know with 100% certainty where attacks would come from. He would be able to easily filter his enemies toward that direction, and thus have the greatest level of preparation. And secondly, if the Rain family did do such a thing, that would give him an above-board reason to simply wipe them out. Lionel stepped foot into the etching metal organization to find a weird atmosphere. When he entered the core regions, he found the reason why quite immediately. On one side of a long oak-forged table, there were 5 women. The moment Lionel saw them, he nearly choked on air, only because he felt that this situation might very quickly get out of hand. 3 of the women were familiar enough. They were Aina, Yuri and Savon. This alone was enough for the place to be a powder keg ready to blow. But usually, due to the fact they were outnumbered, it was a bit easier to manage. But now these 3 had gained Alina and Joyce. 2 girls Lionel was a bit familiar with. They had followed him to Planet Luxnix back then to participate in the selection. The 2 were both born on the moon, and had the exceptionally pale skin and tall stature that came with it. They were just about as tall as Aina, who was already over 6 feet tall herself. In these years Lionel was gone. Clearly Yuri and Savon had become close with Alina and Joyce. The 4 were in lockstep, and Aina would of course be on the side of her best friends since childhood. Yuri was her sister, and Savon was her closest friend. These things were inevitable. On the other side of the table, there were Lionel's brothers. This much wouldn't be an issue if Lionel hadn't known about what happened between Raj and Yuri. But worst of all, it seemed that Raj and Yuri weren't the only ones with history. Joyce was staring at Franco as though he was her mortal enemy. Her fists glowed with a twinkling light before fading and twinkling again. It looked as though she was really thinking about attacking right here and now. Franco pretended like he didn't see anything, taking a sip at a cup that had little nothing in it. But the sip at the faint strands of droplets remaining seemed to only infuriate everyone else all the more. If Lionel remembered correctly, Joyce had an odd fist ability that allowed her to accumulate force and punch it outward. He assumed that this made her fist force quite powerful. But what was more poignant was the fact that her ability matched her personality quite well. The first time she and Franco met, they had been at odds almost immediately. That was because Franco had insisted on Alina's help during the war against the oceanic beasts. That help had placed Alina in the line of fire, all to save a few young men she had only just met that day. Back then, Joyce had threatened Franco with death, but Franco had said that he would have died long ago if Alina was harmed. Hearing that, Joyce could only let it go. But it seemed that now she had entirely new reasons to be furious. Lionel, however, didn't feel that this was surprising. Franco was most definitely the most perverted amongst them, but he also acted out on his perverted intentions. Back in the academy, he flew through women as easily as turning the pages of a book. Unfortunately for him, Joyce didn't seem like the type to docilely let such a thing slide. At the same time, while Joyce seemed to be deciding whether or not she should commit an act of murder, there was Yuri who said calmly and without the slightest ripple on her face. From the beginning, she didn't send a single glance toward Raj as though they didn't even know each other. And while it was Joyce on the women's side that seemed about to explode, it was Raj on the men's side. He looked like he was a step away from ripping a hole through a wall. The cherry on top seemed to be Alina, who kept stealing glances toward Alan. But unlike Yuri, who was purposely ignoring Raj clearly out of spite, Alan didn't seem to be aware at all. He was entirely focused on a tablet in his hands, calculating several things at once as his fingers flew across the screen. Every time Alina saw that he wasn't looking at her, she would dip her head down in disappointment, only to be back to looking at him a half-minute later. While everything seemed to have gone to shit, there was one light on the horizon. Savon and Joel would smile bitterly toward one another from time to time. As the most level-headed of both groups, the two seemed to have become like two peas in a pod. In a corner, Milan and Gil were having the times of their lives, their snickers echoing slightly before they covered their mouths. The moment Lionel entered, all of them looked toward him at once. Hephaestus patted a hand on his shoulder. "Good luck," he said before rushing away. Chapter 1809. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1809. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1809 groan. Representation of Lionel's mother now available on my Instagram at @osbeck_. Lionel wanted to turn and run as well, but before he could, he sensed a particularly fierce gaze on him. He turned slowly to find his lovely girlfriend showing a radiant smile that most definitely was not a smile. He couldn't quite understand how she could look so beautiful and so menacing at the same time. Yuri looked over toward Lionel with a cold expression. Clearly, she wasn't very happy with the mending of Lionel and Anna's relationship. Savon gave Lionel a light greeting, as did the other girls, but soon afterward, they seemed to forget his presence and go back to what they had been doing before. Lionel coughed lightly, trying to clear the air a bit. If those families could see him now, they'd be speechless. Where was the mighty prince now? Unfortunately, when it came to those he cared about, it was a bit difficult for Lionel to be just as cold-hearted. Luckily, before Lionel had to say anything, a saving grace came. The doors opened and Raylion took a step instead. He swept a gaze for a moment before looking toward Lionel. "The Oryx are here," Raylion said evenly. He didn't seem to notice anything about the weird atmosphere at all. Lionel nodded. He actually hadn't expected this to happen, but he was grateful that it had. He would rather deal with this than relationship drama. Who would have thought that he and Aina would end up with the healthiest relationship here? Or maybe that right went to Raylion and Sale. Lionel turned back and gave Aina a grin before rushing away. "Lionel." Elthar unleashed a happy laugh. He appeared before Lionel in a flash, and looked like he was going to give the latter a hug before he suddenly threw out a furious punch. The location was a hidden underground hall of the Etching Metal Organization. The ceiling was incredibly tall at just about 20 meters. Pillars were located around the region, and it looked much more like a cargo region with vehicles coming in and out from time to time. If there was one thing this region wasn't good at, it was suppressing sound. So from Elthar's shout to his sudden attack, it felt like a tornado had rushed into a tunnel, pillaging and ravaging everything. Lionel's eyes narrowed. A dull bronze glow coated his fists as he punched out to meet Elthar. Boom. Lionel felt a strong pulsing power travel up his arm, but it was quickly dispersed throughout his body. However, he didn't move a single inch. By the same token, Elthar didn't move either, standing straight and tall. Even so, a droplet of blood formed on his knuckles and fell silently to the ground. Elthar was clearly surprised by this result. He had expected for Lionel to go flying back like a meteor, but he hadn't thought that Lionel actually wouldn't move at all. In fact, it was he himself who ended up injured in the exchange, albeit just a small measure. "You're so strong." Elther blinked. He had gotten a small rundown of what had happened to Lionel from Raylion, and he had come to understand that Lionel had disappeared for a long while. By that token, he should have gained 10+ years of practice advantage on Lionel. So why were their strengths still so close? If Elther knew that Lionel was actually quite surprised as well, he would have probably cursed the latter to an early grave. What right did Lionel have to be surprised that someone so close to the seventh dimension was just as powerful as he was? Unlike Lionel's brothers, Elther didn't take the conventional path, he followed the God path. In addition, because he had been in the Void Palace during the Cataclysm, while he didn't gain a full 20+ year advantage on Lionel, he had made it up by having quite some gains in the zone. It had to be remembered that before his old man's death, Elther had been given the Oryx Kingdom's world spirit. Clearly, this had benefited him greatly, as even after Lionel resurrected his old man, he refused to take the world spirit back. "I should be asking you that," Lionel said with a chuckle. Elther's expression became somewhat slack-jawed. "What, Lionel fucking with him?" "Fuck you, I didn't enter my true form." "Generals make excuses now?" Lionel raised an eyebrow. At that moment, the chuckle of a significantly more mature gentleman interrupted their conversation. Lionel looked over to find King Oryx walking over with a dignified cadence to his steps. He truly looked like a ruler, and he didn't dampen it before Lionel in the slightest. It was clear that he hadn't come here to submit. Seeing his father, Elther's happiness became far more complicated. He felt that he was stuck between two individuals that he quite liked. Though if he told his father this, he would probably get a smack to the back of the head. How could he be struggling in choosing between Lionel and his own father? Well, the answer to that was actually quite obvious to him. His father wanted him to be a king, he didn't want to be one. Lionel, however, gave him a path toward fulfilling his dreams, to become a general of the battlefield. That was all he had ever wanted. Lionel's smile faded as he looked toward King Oryx. Inwardly, King Oryx was actually quite surprised. He, too, had expected that Elther would blow Lionel in the distance. He was well aware of his son's strength, and he had long since become their greatest combatant, and he had never looked back. But Lionel actually took Elther head-on without taking even a single step back. This had caused King Oryx's position to have no choice but to soften. "It seems that you've grown quite well," King Oryx said with a smile. "You seem to have grown very well, too," Lionel said lightly, though his words seemed to have a different meaning entirely. It was hard to tell if he was talking about King Oryx's strength or his guts. King Oryx's smile faded somewhat. He hadn't expected for Lionel to take such a strong stance. His words seemed casual, but in political sense, they were hyper-aggressive and might as well have been him throwing down the gauntlet. Chapter 1810. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1810. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1810. Too much. King Oryx looked toward Lionel deeply. Elther's lips pressed into a line as he looked back and forth between his father and Lionel. The two didn't seem to have any hatred for one another, but their perspectives were simply different. King Oryx was more than willing to give up his kingdom to his son. After all, Elther was his own flesh and blood. Ultimately, the Oryx were a minority race deep within human territory. It was simply too difficult to entrust their future in the hands of someone who just might abandon them at any time. As for Lionel, he had invested in the Oryx in more than one way. For one, he had resurrected Elther first, and then his father, when he hardly knew either one of them at the time. Back then, it hadn't seemed like a big deal, but now that he had to purge the silver tablet for the sake of saving his brothers, it meant that Lionel had chosen the Oryx over the lives of men and women he had fought shoulder to shoulder with. When things were put into perspective like this, King Oryx's hesitancy was nothing short of a slap to Lionel's face. With Lionel's temper, if it hadn't been for the fact that he had a good relationship with Elther, he would have already taught King Oryx a severe lesson. Lionel wasn't the type of person to hesitate when he made a decision, so it seemed as though he had been incredibly decisive and uncaring when he purged the silver tablet. But the reality was that that was a weighty decision still being borne on his shoulders. He could still remember his final moments in that zone, the only true and undeniable loss he had suffered in his life. He knew that it was selfish of him to act as he had. Those people had believed in him. When they died, they didn't know that there was a chance to be resurrected, but if they had known that such a path existed, how would they feel knowing that he had made the decision to not grant them such an opportunity? None of this was King Oryx's fault, but that didn't change the fact that Lionel's fuse when related to these matters was exceptionally short, even shorter than it usually was. King Oryx was an exceptionally benevolent king. He hadn't hesitated to give up his life for a chance to protect his people. He truly had the heart and valiance of a ruler. He was a true man. However, none of this would stop Lionel's footsteps. It was either he was with him, or against him, there was no in between. "Child," King Oryx said lightly. "You aren't as I remember. It seems that this world has ground down your spirit and left behind something far sharper." Lionel replied just as calmly. "If this is what you believe, then there's nothing much that I can say to you." Lionel nodded slightly. "It really isn't something that you can understand. When your Oryx kingdom still stood, you did nothing as the human kingdom grew stronger and stronger. You feared what their king had become and didn't dare to take action, choosing to remain passive. It was only after I took action and forced the issue that you were forced to take action. Ultimately, you lost your life and much of your kingdom. The people you rule now were introduced to you by me. The strength of your favored son is in great thanks to me. Even the breath you breathe now was granted to you by me. So don't you believe it's a bit silly for you to speak to me as an all-knowing senior of some kind?" Lionel's placid gaze met the Oryx King's own, there not seeming to be the slightest hint of a fluctuation within their depths. The Oryx King fell into silence. This was hard to reply to because it was simply the truth. The details were broadly correct and there weren't any embellishments. Even so. "And how did your actions end? What success did you have, exactly?" King Alexander crossed the barrier to the fifth dimension only recently when the final began, Lionel said indifferently. "It took me only 2 years to reach the point of meeting them at the final gates of their kingdom. Had you not been a coward and joined beneath my banner, it would have taken me 3 months at most. By then, I could have personally defeat him without such unwanted variables." "So your reply to me is that a stranger didn't help you enough, so it's thus the stranger's fault?" Hearing these words, Lionel's placid expression vanished into a smile. "I think you framed it incorrectly. My reply to you is that it took someone with no stakes in your kingdom to make you finally make a choice that wasn't cowardly and passive. And yet, even so, you haven't learned your lesson. You continue to bide your time, continue to be passive, continue to want to sit on the sidelines in hopes that no one will cause you and your people trouble. It's no wonder that your son doesn't want to follow in your steps to become a king. In his eyes, this is all a king can do." Lionel. Elther wanted to interrupt, but he seemed to be shielded outside of the clashing auras of his father and Lionel. "I can tell you this very clearly though," Lionel continued, his aura growing. "I won't let you sit on the sideline. I will not allow such a variable to exist within the barriers of my empire. The Oryx only have one of 2 choices. The first is to follow me as you should have from the very beginning, and the second is to be eradicated." Lionel's gaze turned cold. "I have invested a lot into the Oryx, too much. More than you know. I won't allow your cowardice to dictate the actions of your race any longer." King Oryx's expression went entirely dark. He hadn't expected things to take this turn at all. Just what had gotten into this Lionel? Chapter 1811. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1811. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1811. Unborn. This was exactly what the Oryx King feared. He didn't want for the Oryx to suddenly be forced into a situation where they had no choice but to become the warriors of others. As for Lionel's comments about his cowardice, if such comments could faze him, he would have long since changed his approach to ruling. People who could call themselves kings wouldn't easily change their mind about such things. As for Lionel, his mind had been made up. He had been too nice for far too long. Even disregarding what he had done for the Oryx Kingdom, back when Valiant Heart Mountain was being attacked, it was he who gave them a path to survive. Afterward, he invested a large amount in their development through Elther to ensure that they would take full advantage of their hyper-evolution stage. Those resources were nothing to Lionel now, but to the him of back then, they had practically been everything. And without said resources, how would the Oryx have been able to thrive in the way they had now? None of this even mentioned the fact he had quite literally brought their two most important pillars back to life, or the fact that the only reason they could live such comfortable lives as a member of another race so deep within human domain territory was precisely because of his name and organizations he had helped birth backing them. Even if King Oryx said he wanted to pay back those things in kind, could he even do so? For one, an investment was worth not only the price itself, but also what it was worth to the person receiving it. Let's say that the Oryx King wanted to return the resources Lionel spent on them back then. That process would be akin to giving back a loan without any sort of interest. And to make matters worse, even if the Oryx King did pay this interest, it still wouldn't be enough. Usually, when a person takes a loan, a small interest is applied because the person giving the loan is well off to begin with and most of the risk is on the person receiving the loan. However, in this case, the risk Lionel had taken was just as great. He wasn't some rich tycoon handing over a small percentage of his wealth. He had been akin to a pauper giving up the last few dollars he had on him. The Oryx King repaying him would be akin to two dear friends having an agreement, one of whom would invest the last bits of money they had while the latter used it to make it big. Then years later, the friend who had succeeded would turn around as a millionaire, maybe even a billionaire, and return his friend exactly the amount he had originally invested, no more and no less. This alone would already be enough of a slap in the face and a lesson in picking better friends, but the matter was only made worse by the fact that even if the Oryx King was thick-faced enough to do such a thing, he had no way of returning the value of his life and his son's life. That was the shocking truth. Even if he wanted to return the bare minimum, he couldn't. Lionel knew this quite well, and it was precisely why he had run out of patience. If this so-called Oryx King couldn't make a decision even after almost 3 decades, then Lionel would force him to make one. Lionel didn't wait for the Oryx King to respond and simply turned and left. The fact he hadn't attacked, as far as he saw it, was already an act of benevolence. King Oryx's eyes narrowed, but there was nothing he could say. The ultimatum had already been laid. There really wasn't much else to be said. After Lionel's back view vanished, Elther couldn't help but sigh. "He's right, you know, old man." Elther shook his head. "It's been well over 2 decades since you were resurrected. You should have made a choice by now. It's not as though the circumstances are conventional," King Oryx said lightly. "He wasn't even here. And that's why he's anxious. If he had been here for all 20 years, do you think he would care very much about what help we could provide? You saw how strong he was. Do you think I've been slacking for these last 20 years? The Oryx King's eyes narrowed before he shook his head. "This concerns our entire race. We have no one to rely on but ourselves. We can't allow ourselves to become cannon fodder for others. Plus, I'm getting a bad feeling from this Lionel, a bad feeling that wasn't there before. It's obvious that my patience has revealed something that I wasn't aware of before. It only makes caution all the more important. I don't know what you're talking about, but what I do know is that Lionel had an opportunity to gain a second ability index 20 years ago." The Oryx King frowned. "A second ability index? That's impossible." "It is possible if you eat the egg of an unborn child of a foreign race that spent the last several years being baptized by the vital energies of countless long-dead seventh-dimensional existences. It's even easier when you consider the fact this egg is from a being not of your race, so it wouldn't even technically count as cannibalism. And it's even more enticing when you realize it's an ability index as groundbreaking as shadow sovereignty." The Oryx King's expression flashed. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm trying to say that Lionel entered a Raypack's nest where everyone's goal was to gain this ability index, and yet he was the only one who saw those ugly bastards as people and treated that unborn child like an actual unborn child. If you were there, Father, I doubt even you would be benevolent enough to protect this unborn child as though it was no different from an unborn oryx, right? The Oryx King's heart skipped a beat. All this time, his mind was filled with the echoes of the word shadow sovereignty. He hadn't really cared about the unborn child ever since he heard it was a Rapax. Even Oryx looked more human than they did. Would he save that child? Definitely not. What idiot would give up such an overpowered ability index? Chapter 1812. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1812. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1812. You and you. Lionel entered the tension-filled room once again, his brothers and the girls still glaring at one another. They looked over toward him almost instantly, just like before, but this time they seemed to be able to tell that his mood was the best. Bang. Suddenly, Lionel's palms slammed against the table. Something odd happened in that moment. It was as though Lionel had so perfectly controlled his strength that the table was just on the verge of being shattered to pieces, but not quite there. The result was a wild and eerie vibration that echoed across the room. "All right, that's enough pouting," Lionel said, his voice cold. Yuri's eyes narrowed when she looked toward Lionel, but what she didn't expect was for Lionel to suddenly look back toward her with an equally as cold look in his eye. "Your sister is my wife now. You're going to have to get over it. If you can't, I won't let you see our children. Not even any one of the 27 of them. That I can promise." Aina, who had wanted to say something, was suddenly stunned speechless before she blushed profusely. She couldn't even do her normal routine of asking Lionel who his wife was. She was truly silent for maybe the first time ever. Even Yuri didn't quite know how to react to this. Yuri tried to speak, not quite sure if she should be enraged or not. She had no idea how to even respond to such a thing. "Shut up, I'm talking right now." Lionel's gaze flashed with an oppressive violet light, and Yuri suddenly felt it down to the depths of her soul. Yuri was a spiritual. This much was obvious. As such, even if she had an opportunity to use a soul protection treasure, she wouldn't feel the need to. Her own personal inheritances and her own skill was more than enough. But it was also precisely due to this that she felt the full brunt of Lionel's oppression, taking her somewhat off guard before she quickly defended herself. But by then, Lionel was already speaking again. Alan. Alan, who had still been engrossed in his panel, even after Lionel started making so much noise, finally looked up. His gaze was calm as he looked toward Lionel. Lionel nudged his head toward Alina. "Stop being clueless, she likes you." Alan blinked once, and looked toward Alina, who had suddenly blushed down to her chest. "And you?" Lionel looked toward Alina. "Alan is my brother, I know him well. He doesn't view relationships the way normal people do, and he's not very interested in sexual interactions, although he might be willing to do it if that's what you want. If you want to be his partner, you will have to stimulate him in other ways. It's not exactly impossible. Most women who've liked him have given up. It'll depend on you whether you care enough to follow through. You should probably make that decision as soon as possible." By the time Lionel had finished his words, Alan had already gone back to his tablet, and Alina didn't quite know how to react. She put her head down and blushed harder. Wasn't Lionel a bit too crude? She hadn't even said anything to the girls yet. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately depending on how you looked at things, Lionel wasn't done yet. "And you?" Lionel looked toward Joyce. "Don't start lecturing me, or else I'll show you what my fist can do," Joyce almost growled out. Even though she said this, her face was already red. She just didn't want to be exposed by Lionel like Alina had. Unfortunately for her, Lionel didn't seem to give a damn right now. "Didn't I say shut up already? I'm talking." Joyce suddenly found her next words caught in her throat. It couldn't be said that she knew Lionel exceptionally well, but since when had he been this aggressive? In fact, she had always felt that Lionel was quite passive about a lot of things. He let life come to him, only then did he react. He was very rarely proactive, and he often didn't need to be. But now he felt different. "This guy," Lionel pointed toward Franco, "is a bit of a dick." Franco's mouth opened, but nothing came out. In the corner, Gil slapped his thigh, half dying with Milan. The two seemingly found all of this fucking hilarious. It was too good. Joyce's eyes widened with surprise. She didn't expect Lionel to be on her side. He can't keep it in his pants. He chases women for sport. He doesn't know what it means to settle down even though he's already nearing his 40s. As far as I see it, he's practically a defective product. Franco's mouth hung lower. Lionel had never grilled any one of them like this. But why was it that he wasn't mad and even had a smile on his face he couldn't seem to wipe away? You see that smile on his face? Lionel asked Joyce. He's a masochist through and through. The meaner you are to him, the more he likes it. If you want him, you can have him. So long as you're willing to keep your foot on his neck for the rest of his life. He needs a very, very, very short leash. Joyce covered her mouth, almost forgetting the semi-seriousness of the matter. Why did she find this so amusing? To the side, Gil was practically coughing up a lung. It was hard to tell if he was laughing or if he was going into cardiac arrest. And finally you two. Lionel settled on Yuri and Raj. Yuri was the only one who didn't seem to find any of this amusing at all, but when Lionel spoke, her eyes couldn't help but widen. You're sitting here, glaring at one another, when you have no idea that he died almost a decade ago. You were so mad that you didn't even check on him during that time, and are only just now finding out. Chapter 1813. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1813. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1813. Anytime. Lionel knew the underlying problem here. Spirituals had a far different concept of time than humans did, as they lived over 100 times longer. Raj didn't bother to try very hard to convince Yuri of anything, in one part due to his own pride and personality, and another part due to the fact he didn't think she was trying very hard at all. A year was already far too long, let alone a decade. To Raj, this ship had already sailed and had been over for a long time already, and it was only made worse by the last word Yuri had left him with after their last fight. But this was another problem. Spirituals, especially spiritual couples, could read intentions past their own words. Yuri could also read past Raj's intent and see into his soul. So she had never really been all that enraged, she was just being stubborn. But when Raj made no attempt, she thought that he wasn't trying hard enough, so she wanted him to try more. These two factors, on one side being their difference in how they saw time, and on the other side being how they took words whether at face value or not, had led to such a situation. Obviously, Yuri hadn't discarded her old body and built a new one. This was the very same body she had had long ago. So obviously she hadn't erased her history with Raj. But not only did Raj have no way of knowing that, he also hadn't seen her in almost a decade. Raj had grown up on modern Earth. That kind of time frame was ridiculous. After a decade, you might as well be strangers at that point. It was no wonder the two were so useless in a relationship. It was difficult enough to date a person who didn't share the same cultural background as you, even if you were both human, let alone to date someone who was from a different species altogether. Without a willingness to communicate, they were bound to fail. But luckily for them, Lionel had stopped giving a damn. Yuri didn't think that Lionel would lie about this, and she couldn't help but look toward Raj. Raj, who was still being a bit stubborn, looked away. He thought it would be a bit too corny of him to rely on his death to get a leg up, especially since he was obviously alive and well now. But this reaction only made Yuri more certain that Lionel wasn't lying. Even though she couldn't read Lionel, she could read Raj quite well. All right. Good. Lionel nodded to himself, seemingly feeling satisfied with the silence. Wife. Aina responded subconsciously, causing Lionel to grin. Excellent. Lionel nodded again, leaving Aina blushing once more. What a shameless tactic. Just as Lionel was about to say something more, his eyes narrowed. On cue, Raylion opened the door. By his side, there was Sale, Hephaestus and Emna. What happened? Lionel asked. There's movement. There'll be an attack launched in about half a day. Half a day? Lionel raised an eyebrow before he smiled. This was the benefit of having such a robust information network. Half a day actually wasn't long to prepare, But given the fact that all of this had likely been done in the utmost secrecy, and the fact the enemies attacking were almost certainly already within their territory, the fact that etching metal could give them a half-day buffer was utterly groundbreaking. It might as well have been akin to seeing the future. Lionel couldn't help but chuckle. In his time in the dimensional verse, he was always on his back foot, always reading and reacting to what was happening instead of being proactive. But now that he had such an organization to fall back on, things just might come easy. Hephaestus, this is for you. Lionel flipped over a palm and a box of pills appeared. He handed it to Hephaestus. These pills will synergize well with your ability index. They were prepared by my lovely wife, so be sure to thank her. Aina was beginning to get exasperated, but it felt like this wasn't the right time to say something. This is for you. Lionel repeated the same action for Raylion. This will be less helpful to you than it is for Hephaestus, and you'll also have to be far more careful. A single one of these force pills could kill you. You have to be mentally prepared and ready to endure pain. However, if you survive, this will set the foundation for you moving forward. I have something much better in mind for you. ITLL just requires some time to execute. Raylion solemnly accepted the box. But there was a clear flash of determination in his eye, not dampened by the worry in his wife's eyes. Sail, but have a unique ability index. I've reserved a spot for you in the Midas and Radix family's territory. If you go there, you'll find a surprise and your strength will increase 100-fold, easily. Sail's brows jumped. Her ability index was indeed unique. Even with their information network and scanning through trillions upon trillions of people, she had never found a second one like her. Lionel was certain that the complete inheritance of the Silver Empire was almost tailor-made for Sail. She would most definitely thrive from its use, even more so than the Flora family. Here, Lionel handed Sail an 8th-dimensional sapling similar to the one he had given Gray. With just this alone, her strength would increase quite a measure. Sail accepted it solemnly as well, not knowing what to say. In all these years, she had wondered if her husband's faith in Lionel was warranted. But in just a few moments, he had handed over things beyond her wildest imagination. Just the scent of the pills he had given Raylion and Hephaestus were enough to make her tremble. Emna. Lionel sighed somewhat. Your path is your own. I actually think that if I gave you external items now, it would actually hinder you as opposed to help you. You only need a hint of inspiration to cross that final barrier and more battle experience. Less assassination, more upfront, life-threatening clashes. Are you prepared to do that? Emna's gaze flashed with a fierce light, and she nodded her head. Anytime. The blade force around her seemed to sing. Good. Let's move out everyone. We're going to crush them all in a single sweep. Chapter 1814. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1814. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1814. Subtle. The activity near the borders of the three-pillar sector was very subtle. In fact, from an outside observer, it was hard to tell that anything out of the norm was happening at all. The trading routes were still moving as usual. Tourists still moved in and out as many without families and organizations to rely upon tried to move closer to Earth in hopes of gaining better lives. At the same time, those who had the foresight to see the coming implosion were doing the exact opposite, making their way out to stiller waters. Under all of this normal activity, though an undercurrent was slowly building momentum, covertly, several powers began to come together, having been emboldened by the retreat of Shield Cross stars. Although things had been tense before, they had never reached this extent. The power of the shield was far too great, and even those who were greedy had to temper their impulses. However, with the apparent hot-headed and foolish decision of Alienor, these lurking threats became very real threats. How much longer? We still need a few more hours. This is already fast. If we move any faster, we'll expose ourselves and our organization will be lacking. The most important leg of this war will happen right in the beginning. During the first push, we need to claim at least half of the three-pillar sector. We'll need to secure all of the fast lanes toward the Rain Galaxy. A few hours is fine. Of the two speaking, one was the patriarch of the O'Neill family, and the other was a patriarch of the Bliss family. They were currently in a warship hangar, waiting for everything to be prepared to move out. Most of their warriors were already boarded, and they were just waiting in silence for the signal. There were quite a few families that could control galaxies within the three-pillar sector and the surrounding sectors, and these were just two of them. It could be said that in the grand scheme, they were small fry, but it was also because of this that they would be leading the charge ahead first. It couldn't be helped. As the weak, if they wanted to change their fates, they had to take some risks. It was too dangerous to target families within the three-pillar sector, but from other surrounding sectors, it was much easier. Given the short duration between the disappearance of Shield Cross stars and this attack as well, it was only right that only those that had been corrupted long ago would partake. There wasn't time to convert others. Regardless, this didn't matter to them. As they saw it, Earth was nothing but loose soil. Even their own families warred against one another. With the obstruction of Shield Cross stars, this battle was as good as won. They didn't need to do anything as crazy as conquering the Ascension Empire, although these few family heads didn't doubt that this was the goal of their superiors. All they wanted was a small piece of the pie. Suddenly, boom! Without a word, without warning, the entire hangar was eviscerated, wiped from existence as though it had never existed. The chatting patriarchs didn't even register what happened and weren't even aware enough to know that they had just spoken their last words and had their last thoughts. This matter was repeated dozens of times over. Entire armies of the absolute elite wiped out one after another, like clockwork. It all happened so fast that information couldn't even make it back. It was only after news of the chain of explosions was known that the so-called superiors realized that they had actually been preemptively targeted, but none of them could understand how news of this had leaked. Even if one of their allies were traitors, those small fry would at most know their assigned gathering location. Even in the upper echelon, only a very select few who were aware of all of the locations, but all of these individuals had way too much to lose to betray them. If they didn't, they would have never been trusted to begin with. Unfortunately, before these superiors could understand what was happening, an army descended on their location. In an instant, a battle that should have been waged in the three-pillar sector was fought at its borders, the citizens of the Ascension Empire completely oblivious to what was happening. Lionel stood on the bow of his flagship, his gaze sharp. To his left, an unhappy Harmony sighed. But at the moment, she could only obediently be used as a pawn. Lionel seemed to have every intention of making use of her without a care for her status. To his right, there was a slightly skeptical Aina. But seeing the unhappy expression on Harmony's face, she could only choose to trust Lionel. Behind them, the flagship was flooded with warriors prepared to battle. Lionel took a step forward, raising his foot and placing it on the bow of the ship as he peered over. A grin spread across his face as he looked toward the floating asteroids in the distance. At first, there didn't seem to be anything wrong with them, until one took a second look and noticed the sheer number of warships using their flow as camouflage. Going to continue to hide? Lionel's voice echoed through the vastness of space, rumbling like thunder. It was enough to make the weak feel as though he was squeezing their hearts in his palm. Ah, seems like they don't want to come out. Yip. Yip. Little Blackstar sneered with disdain from Lionel's shoulder, waving his little claws. The simple action sent a surge of pressure through the void, causing the rock face of an asteroid in the distance to explode and send shrapnel in all directions. The warship that had been hiding behind it was pelted and instantly became riddled with holes. It barely managed to hold on. Harmony, why don't you go greet our guests for us? Lionel asked with a smile. Harmony grit her teeth, floating up from the flagship. These people would be very unlucky on this day. She needed someone to vent her frustration on. Chapter 1815. Published at 27th of April, 2023. 9:04 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1815. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1815. Coincidence? Harmony vanished and appeared within the depths of the asteroid belt almost instantly. She crossed the seemingly impossible distance with absolute ease. In a flash, her scythe appeared in her hands and she let out a shriek as she slashed downward. She rampaged about with an unearthed fury. Every time she slashed, rocks would shatter and warships would collapse one after another. It didn't seem as though Amphing could withstand even a single one of her attacks. A light cough echoed to Lionel's back. "Where'd you find this one, Cap?" Gil mumbled. "She's my type. Why don't you introduce me?" Milan suddenly spoke, wiping his drool away with a forearm. "Look at her, she could snap you like a twig. Get yourself together, you're embarrassing," Gil replied quite fiercely. Despite the fact it was clear he couldn't take his eyes off of the sway of Harmony's hips. They couldn't ogle Aina out of respect for Lionel, and because they cared dearly for their lives, but the moment they saw a woman comparable to her, their eyes didn't seem to want to function properly, even threatening to pop out of their eye sockets. "She can snap me like a twig all she wants," Milan replied. Joel, Drake and Arnold looked toward one another and shook their heads. These brothers of theirs were truly too embarrassing. They saw one beauty and already didn't know how to act. They even looked like they would throw down their gauntlets and fight to death, so long as Harmony asked them to do so. "Sure, I can introduce you," Lionel laughed. "She's from the Three-Finger Cult, though." Gil and Milan were suddenly rendered speechless. Since when had they had someone like that on their side? Wait, didn't that also make her an enemy? Lionel was just trying to set them up. She'd sooner stab them to death than date them. The two felt cold shivers run up their spines. Enough! At that moment, a roar came from the asteroid belt. It was all too obvious that their attempt at a covert operation had been entirely thwarted, and even dense networks of traitors they had been building up for the last several years were all wiped out all at once. It could be said that of their cannon fodder, over 90% would never see the light of the next day. Their operation had become a complete failure, and they still had no idea just how things had ended up in this way. Even so, all hope was not lost. Even though their covert operation had failed, those that had died were just their vanguard, weak families they had planned to throw forward to distract the Empire from the true and most lethal threat. Ultimately, they had expected most of those families, if not all, to die regardless. It was just a shame that they couldn't do any damage before then. However, if this was used correctly, Earth and the Ascension Empire would only suffer a greater loss. They had just wiped out countless families without word or warning. This sort of unilateral movement and decision was exactly the kind of thing that would put Earth in a more precarious situation. Right then, the person who had just spoken shot up from the center of the hidden formation of warships. He wore silver and radiant blue armor, his hair just as blue as the sparks of lightning that danced across his armor as well. With his spear in hand, he truly did seem to be a deity incarnate, a feeling only made all the more dominating by his seventh-dimensional aura. Lionel didn't need to think much to know who this was. This was none other than the man in control of the Thrusting Skies sector, Patriarch Alec, head of the Skies family and one of the greatest threats Earth currently faced. He seemed to want to end this battle swiftly as possible, as almost the moment he spoke out, roaring to cover the region in his aura. Then, she struck out with lightning swiftness, the tip of his blade appearing before Harmony in a single breath. Harmony felt oppressed by the aura of a seventh-dimensional existence for only a moment before she blinked and vanished, appearing on the bow of the flagship in an instant. She was already well outside the range of the attack, before it could even build up momentum, let alone land on her. The attack rebounded against the barrier of the flagship, and caused a slight ripple. Lionel could only shake his head toward this sight. Before his interaction with that eighth-dimensional expert from S.H.I.E.L.D. Cross-Stars, such an attack wouldn't have even caused the barrier to waver. Unfortunately, he hadn't found a workaround for the nerf yet. He would have to strengthen his mind further before he could use his internal sight to check on the fusion core and modify it. Even so, the strength it had access to now was enough for him to do what he needed to do. "Your attack is quite ferocious, Patriarch Skies, but don't you think you're wasting time here?" Lionel asked lightly, his expression still quite a bit casual. Alex Skies, who wanted to make a follow-up attack after seeing that the flagship wasn't invulnerable, suddenly paused. His gaze narrowed as he locked onto Lionel. "What are you talking about? Isn't it obvious? How do you think we knew about your location? What about the location of the cannon fodder you had so painstakingly prepared?" Alex's pupils constricted. "What are you trying to say?" "I don't know. Don't you think that it's just a bit convenient?" Of all the important points to gather upon, it was the Rain Galaxy that was chosen. And beyond that, the support you have coming from the outside is the chaotic water sector, right? A nice coincidence, don't you think? Alec was intelligent enough to understand what Lionel meant almost instantly. The chaotic water sector and the Rain Galaxy both specialized in water force. Could this have been planned by the chaotic water sector long ago? Chapter 1816. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1816. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1816 thrummed. Alec suddenly sneered. Did this Lionel take him for a fool? Just how common were the core elemental affinities? Water, fire, earth and wind, you could find them everywhere. He could name a dozen other galaxies just like the Rain Galaxy off of the top of his head. This didn't mean that they all had connections with the chaotic water sector, right? And also, even if he was willing to accept this, what good would betraying their own operation do for the chaotic water sector? If Earth wasn't weakened because it was prepared for the outcome of this sneak attack, then the chaotic water sector would not only lose its strongest allies, when the time came, they would have to face Earth alone. To make matters worse, the original reason why the chaotic water sector wanted to get out in front of this was because they knew that when Earth finished expanding, its competition would only become fiercer. Those large families were still waiting in the wings under the guise of decorum and the greater good. But they all understood how the world worked. The moment the benefits became too great to ignore, the so-called greater good, and its ideals would fly out the window. Unless they could all get their footholds now, they didn't stand a chance in fighting against those families in the future. This was their chance. Here and now. So why would the chaotic water sector ruin that? How ridiculous. Oh, you're doubting me? Lionel chuckled. How did I pinpoint your location then? That's enough, Alec said coldly. Alec wasn't 100% certain, but he had heard rumors of the Ascension Empire's emperor being capable of using his lineage factor to view every aspect of his territory. Although they had believed that this was nonsense, which was why they had moved forward with their plans anyway, this seemed to be the only explanation for what was happening here. In that case, then covert operations would always be their downfall. The only method forward was to suffocate Earth with raw strength. First he would retreat from here, regroup, and then launch an all-out assault when their strength was all in order. The best plan was one the enemy could see coming, and yet couldn't stop anyway. Even if he was wrong, Alec had no intention of making such a decision here. Lionel shook his head and laughed again. Those that could become the heads of such powerful organizations weren't fools. Even if Alec didn't know the truth, that didn't mean that he would so easily accept Lionel's characterization of events. He would instead choose to investigate on his own. Just like the best schemes were the ones others could see coming and yet couldn't stop, the best lies were the ones an enemy convinced themselves of first. It's fine if you don't want to listen to me, but ultimately you should think about it. You're looking at things through a narrow lens. Some people are looking beyond just the human domain. The moment Lionel said these words, Alec's heart skipped a beat. The weight of the words that Lionel had just spoken were so frighteningly heavy that he didn't even want to think about them. He immediately turned and wanted to retreat. Wait a minute now, I still can't let you leave. If I did, wouldn't people think they can just choose to attack my Ascension Empire whenever they want it? Alec sneered. Obviously, he believed that everything Lionel had said before this was bullshit now. If Lionel was really so certain that he would find some dirt on the patriarch of the chaotic water sector, then it would be in his best interest that Alec be released with as much strength as possible. That way, when the two sectors clashed, they would be able to harm one another sufficiently. But when Alec looked into Lionel's eyes, all he saw was the indifferent smile of someone with everything in the palm of his hands. Lionel's thoughts were on a level even seventh-dimensional existences couldn't fathom. If Alec thought he could see through him so easily, there would be nothing but disappointment waiting for him at the end of it all. Well, wipe out half of their fleet, then let them go, Lionel said lightly. Alec suddenly raised his head to the skies, laughing uproariously. However, right then, a voice appeared to Lionel's side. Yes, Emperor. The booming cadence of the voice caused the void to tremble. At that moment, a familiar big-bellied man appeared. He was none other than the overseer of the asteroid convenience station. Since his death, he had been stored within Lionel's snow globe, and now he would have a final battle before his soul dispersed. Lionel pushed off the bow of the flagship, a surfboard appearing beneath his feet as he shuttled through the air with untold speed. "Attack," he said coldly. The big-bellied man, weight valiant violet armor, soared after Lionel quickly before appearing high above his head and slapping his belly twice. His chest expanded and his diaphragm seemed to explode in size. Then he unleashed a mighty roar. The sound wave crushed everything in its path. Alec's eyes widened, and he quickly raised his spear to counter. At that moment, though, Lionel, who had been riding his sleek black surfboard across the starry skies, had already come to a halt, a dark gold panda construct appearing around him, its 6 arms each forming a different sign. Lionel's kidneys thrummed with life, his scarlet star nodes surging as a violent surge of crimson gold force manifested in the surroundings. Watching the snaking fire force take the form of dozens of coiling flood dragons, sparkling brighter than even the stars that were their backdrop, Harmony's pupils constricted. She had already written off Lionel's victory against her as being due to the pressure she had experienced being in Earth's territory, while it was Lionel's home turf to begin with. But seeing this, she couldn't help but wonder exactly how much Lionel had also held back in their fight. Roar. The dozens of flood dragons surged forward. All they knew was destruction, laying to waste everything in their vicinity as Patriarch Alec was held down by his spirit construct. Chapter 1817. Published at 27th of April, 2023, 9:04 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1817. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1817. The best scheme. Lionel sat in silent meditation, his legs crossed and his palms resting on his thighs. In his mind, the battlefield was reflected with absolute perfection. He controlled dozens of fire flood dragons and his spirit construct all at once, and yet his face seemed to be absolutely relaxed. The warriors hidden within the flagship reacted all at once, surging forward like a tidal wave. "Boy," Alec's voice boomed as he shot toward Lionel, but every attempt he made, he found himself entirely obstructed. The worst part of it all was that every time he tried to attack the big-bellied spirit construct with his spear force would vanish entirely. He remembered being warned that his spear force would be useless against Lionel, but he had never taken this seriously. Why would he? He could kill the likes of Lionel with a single finger. Why would he need to use his spear force in the first place? However, he had never considered the fact that Lionel would have the ability to extend his ability like this. Toward this, Lionel sneered inwardly. In the past, spear force had to touch him to disperse. But now he had his absolute spear domain. Within his domain, anyone who wanted to use spear force was living out a dream. Alec began to panic. If it wasn't for the current setting, the situation wouldn't have been so bad. However, because the plan was for them to hide within the asteroid belt, their maneuverability was almost non-existent at this moment. Not only was their usual formation impossible to use, but just escaping was nigh impossible. Lionel obviously knew this, which was why he had only come with the flagship. He never planned to attack with it at all. Instead, he sent forward individual warriors who could maneuver around the asteroids with far greater ease than the large warships could. The strategic advantage was suffocating. It felt like he was being outplayed in all facets. What infuriated him the most was that Lionel didn't even open his eyes to look at him anymore. He simply continued his slaughter. No, he's not just controlling those flame constructs. He's also moving the asteroids to give his people even more of an advantage. It was hard to notice at first because Lionel wasn't causing large reactions, and the asteroids were moving around to begin with. But when Alec began to calm down and analyze the situation so that he could find the best method of escape to minimize the losses, he realized what was happening. Alec's expression couldn't help but become incomparably ugly. Was this the power of a sixth-dimensional existence could have? Some of those asteroids were several kilometers across, and their distance apart was incredibly vast. Although Lionel was only giving them small nudges here and there, This was a feat that even most seventh-dimensional Earth Force experts couldn't replicate. Monster. Alec's blood went absolutely ice-cold. He only realized now what kind of existence he was facing off against. If Lionel made it to the 7th dimension, would it even be possible for those beneath the 8th dimension to even threaten him? Alec's mind couldn't help but flash to another urban legend. Velasco Morales. Could it be that the Morales family was about to produce another undefeatable existence in just as many generations? Roar. The dozens of snaking Scarlet Star Force flood dragons roared out all at once, their eyes opening to reveal reflective violet irises, and their bodies becoming even more corporeal and solid. Their long necks raised into the skies, their bodies expanding as they took deep breaths. At that moment, they looked like the true beasts of legend, plucked right out of their mythos and drawn across the starry skies with a menacing aura. Their breaths came to a stop all at once, and Lionel's eyes suddenly flashed open with a cold light. No, Alec called out. It was too late. Balls of fire dozens of meters across formed one after another, and each flood dragon breathed out, unleashing carnage everywhere their breath of crimson and gold passed. The sheer destructive ability of fifth-dimensional Scarlet Star Force scorched the skies, burned the eyes and trembled the heart. Warships that had been through dozens of wars, hundreds of battles, and thousands of injuries were turned to molten metal in a mere instant. The palms of Lionel's dark gold panda construct opened up, and the flood dragon constructs vanished. But even more quickly than that, the motes of flames that remained in the skies quickly formed into majestic mage arts. Magic circles so complex one's head spun just looking at them were created one after another. Within his ethereal glabella, Lionel's mana core rustles, its countless leaves dancing with a delicate light. Compared to the commotion happening outside, it was incomparably calm, its runes lighting up one after another. Back outside, the starry skies trembled as the aura of destruction continued to increase. Space whined and twisted. Force collapsed before it could form. Weaker constructs began to collapse from the outside and before the spell even descended. Countless spears appeared in the air, each marked with a crown of royalty around their polearms. Lionel slowly pressed his palms together before opening them up and pressing outward. His irises danced with a malevolent light, and the spears in the skies stopped trembling all at once. An eerie silence fell over. Meeting Alec's gaze, Lionel smiled lightly. Destroy, he said lightly. The spears descended. Like an imperial edict, they wiped out everything in their path, shattering them, grinding them, burning them, sundering them ashes. Flashes of light brighter than even the starry skies boomed across the battlefield. Before the destruction was even concluded, Lionel slowly stood to his feet, allowing his panda construct to vanish. Retreat, he said evenly. Lionel turned back, ready to return to the flagship, but his steps suddenly paused. Oh right. Lionel smiled as he looked back toward Alec, who was entirely pale-faced. He could only watch as his people were destroyed one after another. You might want to think of an adequate explanation for why you were the only seventh-dimensional existence here, Lionel said with a laugh. Good luck, I hope they believe you. Alec's eyes opened wide. He was the only seventh-dimensional existence here because it was the smart choice. Between the chaotic water sector, the Viola family, and his thrust sky sector, he was in the most vulnerable position. The Viola family already shared a sector with Earth, and their foothold was strong. In fact, in Alec's opinion, he felt that they were quite greedy to participate in this to begin with. The chaotic water sect was outside of Earth's territory, so the pressure on them was nigh non-existence. They were only here to prepare for the future. Only his family was caught in an awkward in-between. They were both within Earth's territory, and yet not close enough to maximize all benefits. Their hands were practically forced. Due to this, he chose to be cautious and left a lot of their fight power back in their sector. But the trouble was that this wasn't the original agreement, and he had acted on his own. He had thought the ask to bring more than just himself was asinine, so he sneered at the request and did this instead. He hadn't thought much of it before because he was certain this operation would succeed. Until it suddenly didn't. Never had Alec expected that all this time, while it seemed that Lionel was trying to sow doubt in him toward his allies, it would actually end in Lionel making his allies doubt his thrusting skies sector instead. Alec trembled and nearly suffered a fatal blow from the spirit construct. The best scheme was one you knew was a scheme and yet could do nothing about it. If Alec wanted to stop himself from being targeted by the Viola and the chaotic water sector, the only path forward was to give a good reason for his actions. A reason that Lionel had already given him. The only path ahead was to divert blame. Suddenly, the connection between the chaotic water sect and the Rain Galaxy looked more and more obvious to him. Alec watched Lionel's back get further and further away, clenching his fists so hard that his fingers dripped with blood. Chapter 1818. Published at 5th of May, 2023, 8:29 and 2 seconds AM. Chapter 1818. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1818. Important. Alec took deep breaths. About halfway through the fight, he had begun to wonder why it was that Lionel had chosen him out of everyone. Logically, his position was the most covert of them all, and the most difficult to pick out. If he could find out about his location, then finding the position of the chaotic water sector and the Viola family would be even easier. But that was just one aspect. Just as logically, the Skies family had been in the least compromising position. They were the most out of the way. The threat posed was the lowest. Only now did Alec understand that Lionel had done all of this on purpose. All of those points would only further count against him. He could imagine it now, the questioning looks he wouldn't have the answer for. He felt entirely helpless. Who would believe that a prince who had impulsively killed 4 of Earth's strongest families could bide his time and scheme like this as well? Alec almost believed that Lionel had actually killed off those families as a convenient veil for his true self. There was even news that Lionel had just as impulsively charged into Viola territory. Although it had been exposed that that was a clone, everyone believed that only a clone of the highest quality would be so good. Considering the resources it would take to create such a clone, they still assigned impulsivity to that action, although Lionel ultimately didn't die. Of course, they had no idea that that clone had cost Lionel nothing but the corpse of an enemy, as they had no idea how his lineage factor worked, nor had the world learned of his emulation spatial force innate node yet. The more Alec thought about it, the more he felt like he was stepping into an intricate web laid out by Lionel, a web that if he took just a single wrong step in, he would find himself trapped within and slowly bled until he simply had nothing left. And the more Alec thought like this, the more nigh mythical Lionel's existence became in his mind, and the more suffocated he felt. Suddenly, he felt like the only way to survive was to, indeed, do as Lionel had said. Lionel exhaled his own breath, but it had little to do with nervousness, or even fatigue. He simply had some thoughts that he wanted to organize and a feeling deep within him that he felt that he clicked with. Just now was the first time he had used his dream force since his sudden enlightenment, or more accurately, it was at least the first time he had done so to actively attack, and not just passively within his own head. And the feeling had been quite magical, despite the fact he had only used it as a secondary supposed force to his emulation dream force. Those flood dragons he had formed back then had been constructed with the Luxnix family force art system, or more accurately, the force art system of the Northern Star Light Star elemental lineage factor. This was the very force art that could be comprehended through the tablets. From Lionel's comprehension, that force art system was exceptionally good at creating constructs, creations that felt almost like living, breathing existences. It gave the force arts more flexibility, but at the same time they tapped into the artistic conception of the beasts they embodied, pulling power from them. The flood dragons that Lionel created mostly came from his mother. Lionel had chosen a humanoid construct for his king's might, but his mother had chosen a dragon for her emperor's might. He hadn't heard of dragons actually existing outside of myths and legends, and that was even after reading through everything within the Void Palace. In fact, dragons seem to be a creation of Earth's mythos in specific. As Earth's world spirit holder, Lionel believed his mother likely had a special connection to the mythos of Earth in specific, which was why she was able to create such lifelike versions, and even base her emperors might construct on it. This aside, Lionel had only gotten an inkling from techniques his mother had left behind for him back when he first came to the Luxnix family, and he often liked creating attacks based on them, although he was aware his conception would always be far off from his mother's. But this time, something had changed. Rather than chasing after his mother's conception of dragons, he veered from it and somewhat created his own, basing it not on some mythology of dragons, but rather upon what he personally thought they should embody. As he was doing it, the Force art system, which should have been formed entirely of his Scarlet Star Force at the time, naturally incorporated his emulation spatial force, and even his King's Might at the same time. His emulation spatial force relied on his dream force to make the flood dragons more real than they had ever been, even to the point that they roared like real beasts. At the same time, they had gained violet eyes that looked almost exactly like Lionel's own. He even vaguely felt that he could have seen through their perspective if he had really wanted. When those eyes were formed, it was as though they were no longer constructs and had truly become beasts. The carnage they wrought was on a completely different level, and the power output was maximized when the stamina requirements on his part for an equivalent level of devastation had been minimized. It was an extremely magical feeling, almost as though he was truly breathing life, giving life, creating life. It was like he was a god forging the world into his image, and he had said, "Let there be dragons." The Northern Star lineage factors had always had an underlying reliance on the mind, and thus dream force. No matter which evolution of the lineage factors you were at, there was always an aspect that influenced the mind directly, and now Lionel felt that he had found a connection between this and his dream force that allowed his comprehension of the Force art system to soar. And it was all because of a small improvement in his force manipulation standards. Lionel had already known before, but now he knew better than ever just how important force manipulation was to personal strength. Chapter 1819. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:38 and 8 seconds AM. Chapter 1819. Imagination. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. What? Richard frowned for the first time in as long as he could remember. He couldn't remember having ever had a fluctuation in his emotions in recent years, at least not one that was large enough to show so prominently. He had gone through too much in the last several years. The destruction of his family, countless humiliations in the Void Palace, being swallowed up by that zone, the death of his last remaining family member and brother. There wasn't enough to make him frown these days. But this was a bit much. The news seemed to come one after another, but the most frustrating part was that it wasn't coming through the channels it should have. Rather than their own people reporting back saying that they had been attacked, they had been wiped out so fast that they couldn't even do that. Instead, Richard was reaching reports from miscellaneous businesses of his and the Viola family that had been in the general area, who were only contacting him to let him know that business would likely be slow for the next coming weeks due to the commotion. After all, tourists wouldn't be in a happy, buying mood if their tourist destination had suddenly become a war zone. And yet, even after several such businesses contacted Richard and the Viola family about this matter, likely all afraid that they would be accused of embezzling funds if they didn't do so, there was still not a word from the actual alliances of this coming war. And then it came. The first to contact him was Alex Skies. The patriarch of the Thrusting Skies sector was absolutely furious. Richard could hear the thunder booming in the background, and the strikes of lightning spilling about. He had immediately accused one of them of setting him up. Richard could hardly get a word in, not because Alec was so overwhelming to him, but because he was absolutely shocked to find out that half of Alec's fleet had been wiped out. After Richard regained his bearings, smoothed out his frown and took a breath, his aura changed. "That's enough." The ice cold of his voice cut the Skies family patriarch off completely, stifling all of his momentum. Even the sounds of thunder and lightning on the other side seemed to have been quelled. "What reasons do you have for suspecting us? Isn't the result enough?" Alex said coldly. "Do you think I just imagined half of my fleet being wiped out? My Skies family location was in the most covert region there was, but it was also in the region most susceptible to an ambush. How could we even maneuver in those asteroid fields? We relied entirely on this information being airtight, and yet somehow we were the ones to suffer? I also can't help but tell by your tone and surprise that obviously you weren't attacked. Am I supposed to take that as a coincidence?" Richard didn't seem to take this accusation very seriously at all. Instead, he flipped over a palm. According to my information, the only seventh-dimensional existence who followed the fleet was you and you alone. By all rights, the one with the most odd actions was yourself. This was supposed to be an all-out assault. Did you expect to deal Earth a blow with nothing but a horde of sixth-dimensional existences? Or maybe you didn't plan on dealing them a blow at all. What, did you want to play both sides? Exposing our allies and pretending to have been hurt yourself as well to get off scot-free? After saying all of this, Richard expected something very different from the other side than what he actually expected. He wanted to hear a flustered response, a disorganized rambling, a man on his back foot, but instead all he got was a laugh and a sneer. Aren't my actions perfectly justified judging by what actually happened? If I had brought out my full team, wouldn't I be finished? You mighty Viola and warriors of the chaotic water sector might be able to afford the loss of nothing but a horde of sixth-dimensional existences. But my Sky's family cannot. They were our future. And many of them had potential to reach greater heights. I'm not going to sit here and try to justify myself to a person who didn't suffer even a single loss. Richard fell into silence, his expression unreadable. What reason would I have to betray you? Richard finally asked. Do you have any idea how much I loathe the Ascension Empire? What they've done to me? If you want to make up a story, at least make it make sense. Unexpectedly, Alec only continued to sneer. I've known from the beginning that you were in this for nothing more than a personal vendetta. You are the most untrustworthy kind of ally because you move with your heart instead of your head. Even if I had told you the information I had previously, you would have still gone ahead and did this. Richard paused before biting. What are you talking about? The goals of the chaotic water sector are not the same as ours. In fact, I suspect that they're being pulled along by the cloud race, using them to dictate their actions. Their ultimate goal isn't to defeat Earth in this round. What they want is Earth to become public enemy number one, so that the rest of the human domain attacks them at once. You certainly have quite the overactive imagination, Richard replied blandly. And that's exactly the response I would expect to hear, Alex said coldly. Does it make sense for me to simply take your words at face value? If you knew this, why did you still agree to act? Why did I still agree? The Zoltine faith was wiped out. The Imperial Prince made a personal visit to you. Who do you think was next? I had no choice but to try and deal a blow to the Ascension Empire in hopes they wouldn't have time to deal with me. But who would have thought that I would be backstabbed by my own allies first? Chapter 1820. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:38 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1820. Entangled. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Richard fell into silence once more. What proof do you have? Richard asked. I would advise you to look into the Rain Galaxy, Alex said coldly before directly hanging up. Richard sat in silence for a long while, not saying anything. His mind seemed to go through several iterations and thoughts before he sneered. If Alec had acted flustered when Richard first questioned him, he would have believed him. However, that response was too prepared, too practiced, too ready. He had clearly been ready for the questioning. When someone did something suspicious by coincidence, it wouldn't be at the forefront of their mind. Often they wouldn't even notice the oddity until someone pointed it out to them. For example, let's take a couple in a relationship. If one of them had a habit of always putting their phone face up but one day placed it face down not just once, but a few times in a row, what would they do if their partner confronted them about this? If they had noticed the change in action in themselves, in all likelihood, they would already have a prepared answer. But if they reacted flustered, it would mean that they hadn't thought much about it, and would be more likely to be innocent in the matter. This could be the case if the phone of said partner recently got a new case that made it more difficult to pick up while it was face up, so they had gotten into the habit of placing it face down now for easier access. They might have made this choice subconsciously and never really once thought about it. Of course, it would be a shame either way, but most took someone being flustered as a sign of guilt, when this wasn't always the case at all. And that was especially for absolute experts. Richard trusted an expert like Alec who could see this problem coming to be ready with a perfect answer, which meant that he was even more certain that Alec was lying precisely because of said perfect answer. In Richard's mind, this confirmed that Alec had defected. The best lies were marred in truth. Likely he had felt the pressure from the destruction of the Zoltene faith in just a single day, and that was only compounded by the destruction of the Brazinger, Aderna, Crutus and Lavis families. As such, he chose to exchange information with Earth for safety, and all he had to give up in exchange was some six-dimensional existences. Richard didn't doubt that the destruction of those warships was real. They wouldn't do this by half measures. So he didn't even bother to double-check. With a thought, Richard waved a hand, and an attendant came into his office. Send a few covert teams to the sites of destruction. If you're caught and questioned, use the businesses as a shield. Say that you heard there was a war, and came to protect the businesses from looters. While you're there, focus on gathering as much intel as you can. Report back to me anything interesting you find in 3 days' time. Yes, Patriarch. Is there anything else? The woman asked. Richard was about to wave her away, but he paused for a moment. Although several minutes of this silence passed, the woman didn't dare to disturb his thoughts. Eventually, Richard looked up again with a piercing gaze. Send a team to the Rain Galaxy. The goal this time isn't covert operations, but an all-out seizure. Subdue their family, crush their spirit, and take control of their land. I also want this done within 3 days. Yes. The woman bowed and left quickly. Richard tapped his large oak desk in silence for a moment, seemingly waiting for something. And then it came. The crystal on his desk buzzed, and the face of a familiar man appeared. He was none other than the patriarch of the chaotic water sector, Greros. Greros' expression was just as cold and indifferent as Richard's, but deep within his gaze, there was a clear displeasure. I just tried to contact the sky's patriarch, Greros said before pausing. He did not respond. Richard's gaze narrowed. Somewhere deep inside, he had assumed that Alec would have put on the same act for the both of them. Maybe even telling Greros the same thing he had told him but in reverse. Maybe in the tale he told Greros, it was Richard who was colluding with the Cloud race. But the fact that Alec had only contacted him but not Greros was curious. Did he do it on purpose to make Richard second-guess himself, or was there another reason? I assume he didn't want to have to rehash the same accusation twice, Richard said indifferently, repeating much of what Alec had said, only leaving out the matters related to the Cloud race. I see, Greros nodded. This is a hiccup, but it isn't something that can't be overcome. Even if the Skies family is on the side of the Ascension Empire now, that's just one more enemy. There's little to worry about. Richard nodded. Obviously, Greros had come to the same conclusion he had. I've already acted, Richard said. I've sent an elite group to conquer the Rain Galaxy. We can't allow any more variables to appear. And since we've been exposed, there's no need to use such a weak family as a middleman any longer. We're already out in the open, so there's already nothing to hide. We will press forward in a domineering manner. Agreed, Greros said with a nod, not showing any dissatisfaction toward Richard's ask. Good. Good. The two hung up and fell into silence in their own respective corners of the universe. After hanging up, however, Greros' own expression became somewhat malevolent before he called in his own attendant. Tell the ones in the Rain Galaxy to retreat and hide themselves properly. Wait for my orders before taking any action. Yes, Patriarch. As the saying went, the best schemes were ones one could see but could only fall right into, and the best lies were laced with truth. What Alec, Richard and Greros didn't know was that as they believed themselves to be cleverly navigating Lionel's web, they were only being further entangled. Chapter 1821. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:38 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1821. Cloud, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Shouldn't we be going to the other locations now? Hephaestus suddenly asked. In truth, Hephaestus was a bit anxious. The pills Lionel had given him were burning a hole in his spatial device, and he was trying his best not to be impatient and wait for this to calm down before he consumed them. But seeing Lionel be so nonchalant about it, all, even leisurely reclining and staring into the depths of space, as though he was in his own dream world, left him unable to remain quiet. Lionel, who had indeed been in his own world, looked up. Hephaestus nearly fainted. He had thought that Lionel might be thinking about something important, so he had felt slightly bad for interrupting, especially considering his original reasoning. But seeing Lionel's somewhat dazed look, he didn't even know what to say. The Sky's family wasn't the only worry. We have other enemies to deal with quickly. Even if we dealt a blow to them, those people were just cannon fodder. Most of them weren't even strong enough to control a galaxy to themselves. We can't get complacent now. Several gazes landed on Lionel when Hephaestus said this. In truth, he was correct, and the fact Hephaestus of all people was saying it spoke volumes. He was usually the meathead who let Raylion make all of his decisions for him. But right this moment, Raylion was as relaxed as Lionel, sitting in silence seemingly without any intention to say anything. Hephaestus knew Raylion too well, considering that man's pride. Even if he was feeling as anxious as he was to start absorbing the rewards Lionel had just given them, he wouldn't say anything about it. So Hephaestus knew that it was up to him to say something. Currently, the group was in a lounging area of the flagship. There was food and snacks around, and it didn't seem like a post-battle region at all. In fact, that battle had almost been too easy. They hardly had any casualties at all. Oh, that. Lionel said lightly. Don't worry about it. Hephaestus choked on air. What was that supposed to mean? Don't we have to deal with the Viola and chaotic water sectors? Them? They've been dealt with. We don't have to do anything for the next few weeks. Next time you hear information from them, they would have crippled themselves. Lionel yawned slightly, feeling a bit tired. Indeed, he had been doing too much running around lately and not enough resting. He faintly closed his eyes, seemingly about to take a nap. Hephaestus frowned. Lionel's words implied that they could do what they wanted for the next few weeks. But was this true? The members of the etching metal organization looked toward one another. They knew too little about Lionel, and even for those of them that did, it had been over 2 decades since they last saw him, so they were feeling that the situation was a bit odd too. However, before Hephaestus could follow up again, Raylion slowly stood to his feet and walked away. He was clearly taking Lionel's words to heart, and was returning to his quarters. He had waited too long. It was about time he transcended his limits. Seeing this, Hephaestus understood. Ironically, of all those here, Raylion probably had the most respect for Lionel, despite the fact Raylion was so standoffish. If Lionel said the matter was handled, then it was handled. As for the others, like Lionel's brothers and Aina and the girls, the former group didn't need to be told twice, and the latter followed Aina's cues, and she obviously took Lionel's words very seriously as well. Just like this, a supposed war ended after just a single half-body and a few dozen ambushes. As for the instigator, he reclined in a chair, his eyes closed and his breathing steady. He let the flagship drift through space as though nothing at all was happening. Within their rooms, Hephaestus and Raylion glared down at the pills they had been given, their heartbeats dancing at various rates. This meant a lot more for Raylion than it did for Hephaestus, or most others for that matter. Raylion had wanted to be number for as long as he could remember. He had an absolute obsession for power. It was what he cared about the most, at least in his youth. As he grew, he found other things he cared about, but that fire had still been there. It was just unfortunate that though he had once thought himself to be a great talent, to the wider dimensional verse, he was simply not worth very much at all. Staring at the pills, he could remember all the hardship he had gone through to make it to this level. He could have accepted Lionel's help all those decades ago, but his pride hadn't allowed him to. He refused to take handouts he hadn't earned. Now he had built up the best information in the whole of Earth's territory, and his hard work had grown the seed that would allow Lionel to crush so many enemies even while silently reclining in his chair. This was something he had earned. With his own 2 hands, this was the chance he had been waiting so many years for. Raylion opened the box with steady hands. He knew that just eating one of these might lead to his death, and all that hard work would have meant nothing. He sometimes thought about what it would mean to live a life of mediocrity, to be constantly protected by his own wife, to sit in the shadows and man an information network. But it simply wasn't in his being, it wasn't in his heart. It wasn't in his soul to be that man. The universe hadn't blessed him with great talent, but if it gave him another path to it, he swore that he would show it just what kind of mistake it had made snubbing him. Raylion reached forward and swallowed the first pill without hesitation. No more than half a breath passed before his body exploded into a cloud of flesh and blood. Chapter 1822. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:38 and 3 seconds AM. Chapter 1822. Irony and family values. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The raid on the Rain Galaxy occurred almost immediately after Richard's orders were given out. Richard himself had no need to move out. A single elite team of the Viola family was more than enough. In just a single day, the Rain Galaxy was already unable to mount a counterattack, being forced back into the own territory further and further. The real shame of it was that they could have made this a real battle. But according to their deal with the Chaotic Water Sector, the Thrusting Skies Sector and the Viola family, the original intention was for them to pretend to be a third party caught in the conflict. They were meant to battle, but purposely lose. While they would suffer a few casualties, it wouldn't be anything that they couldn't recover from. But how could they guess that the Viola hadn't come here for a play? They had come here to conquer in earnest. By the time the Rain Galaxy realized that something was wrong with this picture, and began to fight back in earnest, it was already too late. Just because a family controlled a galaxy, didn't mean that they had perfect control over all aspects of it. Normally, it meant that they had key bases in a majority of the quadrants at the very least, and could as such deploy troops anywhere within said region in a timely fashion. The Rain family met this criteria, but the Viola family countered it perfectly, not only taking advantage of the Rain family's surprise, but also by swiftly taking control of key regions, and moving on just as swiftly. They killed a large majority of the powerful experts they came across, which was another reason the Rain family took so long to catch on to what was happening. In order to maintain secrecy and to make the hearts of the laymen go cold from being sacrificed, only the most elite of warriors knew the truth of what was happening. But with them dying, no one was reporting back the oddity of the situation. Only reports from lesser warriors were coming in, which were obviously ignored. Like this, the Rain family was beaten back to their main estate. The elders could only watch on with solemn expressions, regretting their decisions. If they had known that this would happen, how would they have ever agreed to trust the Viola? Even Earth hadn't made any attempts to conquer them yet, and now they practically fell to their knees in just a few days. Standing on warships high in the skies, the elites of the Viola family stood. Lexus Viola, Destiny Viola and Eddie Viola, three great talents of the pinnacle of the sixth dimension, all of whom had names that rang quite frequently in Earth's territory. But now, they had their blades pointed toward the Rain family. Just one of them was enough to strike fear in them, let alone all three. What is the meaning of this? I thought we had a deal. Is this how the Viola family treats its allies? The current matriarch of the Rain family, Darla Rain, a middle-aged woman brimming with vitality, couldn't help but shout out, the weather replying to her fury with a thunderous rain. Unfortunately, the Viola family was entirely unmoved by this. Kill them all, Lexus said coldly. The Rain family paled as the warships descended. The heat of their engines and power of their winds raised the Rain estate to the ground before they even touched down. By the time they actually did so, millions had died. The sheer size of these warships was too much for Planet Rain to handle, but there was nothing they could do to stop it. The Rain family was eradicated with a great amount of grievances. In her final moment, Darla could only release a final plea for help. It wasn't the first time she had released this signal, but she had been ignored every time. Even in the end, as she breathed her last, a sword through her lung, that help never came. Lexus cleaned off his sword with a close, his purple eyes piercing and cold. We caught those outgoing signals, correct? Lexus asked. Yes, we did, Destiny replied, stretching out her curves with a lazy expression as though she couldn't be bothered to have participated in this battle. She didn't look like she had either. There wasn't a bead of sweat or blood in sight on her. What's the result? It seemed to have been a scatter shot. From what the technicians said, It was a web signal designed to be spread and only be gathered by those that have the appropriate decoding methods. Is there a way to decode those methods? We need to finish this to the end. Leaving enemies behind is a huge taboo. And if they're connected with a large power, well, the so-called no enemy left behind philosophy of the Viola family had ironically come due to Richard himself. He saw the kind of enemy that he had become due to Lionel's neglect, so he had grilled his family's juniors to never make the same mistakes. It was truly an irony of all ironies. There shouldn't be a problem. The decoding process will take a few days. A few days? Lexus turned serious. A few days was enough for information of what had happened here to leak, and allow those who this message had been meant for to retreat. But more importantly than that, if it took their best days to decode these messages, then this was definitely a message delivery method far beyond the Rain family. It seems that their patriarch may have been correct about the Rain family's connection to larger powers. This was interesting, and somewhat troubling at the same time. This could be a large deal or a small deal depending, but they would have to properly investigate it first. Only that way could they be prepared to deal with the rest. Their family had been wiped out once before, but their patriarch had allowed them to make a comeback. That humiliation was taught to every youth. They would never allow such a thing to happen again. Chapter 1823. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:38 a.m. Chapter 1823. Chaos. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1823 Chaos. The days passed by quickly, and Lexus eventually got his answer. News. What's the report say? To the side, Eddie perked up as Destiny unfurled a document. They had all been somewhat anxious. If this had just been about the Rain family, it was no big deal. But it was clear to them that there were some large existences moving in the shadows, existences that they would definitely have to deal with to pave out the path for their future. Destiny quickly scanned the news and her gaze narrowed. According to this, there are literally dozens of locations. The team thought that they might be decoys to throw us off the scent. All of the locations seem to be very well hidden. Some are restaurants, some are convenience stations. There are also a few brothels and entertainment centers. It's hard to tell without an even more thorough investigation which of them are real and which aren't. This was troublesome. They had already wasted 3 days on this. If they wasted any more time, there would be nothing left to find. They had done an excellent job of suppressing the information until now, but it could only last for so long. No, we can't wait any longer. I'll contact the patriarch, but get moving on my orders now. Build up enough teams to attack all of them at once. Also make sure that each team has at least a few elite 7th-dimensional existences. We can't afford to send in a team that is too weak and potentially suffer a loss because of it. Well, go all out. Destiny and Eddie both nodded, agreeing with the sentiment. The operation began almost immediately. They had already prepared for this potential outcome, so the teams were already mostly formulated. All they were lacking were the 7th-dimensional existences, and that approval would come from Richard himself. Until now, Richard had been hiding how many such powerhouses he had, but now he sat at a bit of a crossroads. When Lexus contacted him with the information, he took a moment to pause. The fact that these lines of communication existed at all seemed to confirm that the Rain family was, indeed, in cahoots with the chaotic water sector. But he had already informed the chaotic water sector days ago of their attacks, so if they were aware of this potential breach, they should have been ready to deal with it quickly. Due to this reason, Richard was less worried about the time aspect than Lexus, and the others were because he knew the full scope of the story. But it was also precisely due to this that Richard had to okay the attack regardless. If he hesitated for some reason, he would alert the chaotic water sector to the issue at hand. Guerreros would definitely raise an eyebrow if he knew Richard had such information and chose not to act on it. And he might realize that Richard had some information about this matter. In order to keep the status quo, Richard had to attack. Only then could he keep Guerreros guessing about whether or not he was aware or not. But there was another reason as well. Richard needed to confirm whether or not Alec was speaking nonsense. There was a potential world where Guerreros had connections with the Rain Galaxy, but had no connection with the Cloud race. As Richard saw things now, it was still far more likely that Alec had betrayed them and was using Guerrero's potential secrets as leverage for himself. Richard had secrets. He hadn't been forthright with how many seventh-dimensional experts he had and many other things. There wasn't anything inherently wrong with them keeping secrets from one another, and a connection between the Rain and Chaotic Water Sector families was potentially benign. Richard maintained a level head. There was absolutely no reason to fall out with Guerreros over this matter. The way he saw it, things could go one of a few ways. First, they attacked and found nothing because Guerreros had smartly moved his things away already. This was what Richard most expected to happen. Second, they attacked and found some traces that led them to a different trail away from the Chaotic Water Sector. This was potentially likely to happen as well, though it might be troublesome for Guerreros to set something like that up in a small time. Third, and the smallest likelihood, he would attack and find that Alec hadn't been lying at all, and there were some connections to the Cloud Race indeed. Ultimately, Richard didn't expect to find anything substantial, although he would leave no stone unturned as he performed a nice play for Guerreros. As things stood now, Guerreros was far better as an ally than an enemy, even if he had some secrets. If he chose to backstab Richard in the future, well, Richard wasn't the young man of the past. His scheming nature had matured and his ability to see the chessboard was far clearer than most. He would be ready when that time came. For now, Guerreros, the Rain Galaxy, even Lionel and the Ascension Empire. They were all useful pawns. The operation proceeded, and war broke out across the Ascension Empire. The Viola family swooped down like vipers, extending their claws and unleashing swift and decisive strikes. For across these dozens of locations, the Viola family found countless powerhouses, many of which wiped out large numbers of their elites before they were finally taken down. In the end, Richard's most likely outcome didn't come to fruition. Rather than finding nothing, they found all-out battle. Richard calmly accepted this outcome. It seemed that Guerreros had managed to set up the second option, even being willing to give up so many seventh-dimensional existences to succeed. Could it be that Guerrero's foundations were far deeper than he knew? Richard immediately commanded that the investigation begin. He wanted to see what backstories Guerreros had concocted for these men and women. What Richard didn't know was that across the universe, an old man with a balding head and furiously blowing mustache had shattered the windows to his office again. Cross Elder Avon stood completely furious. Ascension Empire. His roar billowed across the empire. Richard had no idea that the bases he had just destroyed weren't from the Chaotic Water Sector at all. Guerreros had long since commanded his men to retreat and hide. Those many stations he had destroyed, every single last one of them, was a hidden branch of Shield Cross Stars, locations that Lionel had gotten by deciphering the force art hidden within the phone left behind in the convenience station. Small leaks even in a dam spanning countless kilometers could lead to floods. By now, the small leaks were too numerous to account for, because very soon, the straw that broke the camel's back was about to descend. Cross Elder Avon, there's something wrong. The reports we've received back don't tie back to the Ascension Empire at all. In fact, these signatures. Cross Elder Avon's rage calmed, his gaze becoming a piercing cold. Cloud Race? He questioned. Chaos was about to break loose and the young man who caused it was reclining in his chair, still snoring away. Chapter 1824. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:37 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1824. Prepare if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1824. Prepare. Cloud Race? How? Explain it to me. Quickly. Cross Elder Avon was becoming impatient, but at the same time, something felt fishy here. Why would the Cloud Race attack them? The obvious answer was because Shield Cross Stars was interfering with Earth, and this was messing with the Cloud Race's goal. But that was only a surface answer that didn't get to the deep roots of the matter. Only a low-level tactician would fall for such a thing. While it seemed harmful for the Cloud Race for the Shield Cross Stars to be so involved in Earth's matters, even if it was from the shadows, in reality, it was almost nothing but beneficial. So long as Shield Cross Stars existed in Earth's territory, it meant that humans would be butting heads. And so long as the humans were butting heads, It allowed the cloud race ample chances to take advantage and sow discord, making their plans flow even smoother. The less variables there were in Earth's territory, the more obvious any discord became, and the easier it was to pick out detractors. Like this, any movement that the cloud race made would have to be even more covert than usual, thus being contradictory to their original goals. If the cloud race had a halfway decent tactician leading their charge, which they most definitely did, they would not only not destroy shield cross stars, they would ironically use them as their own shield, hiding behind them to reinforce their actions. The fact that things had happened in this way, and so boldly at that, made Cross-Elder Avon believe that the cloud race was responsible even less. Unless that's why they were so bold in the first place? Avon narrowed his eyes before shaking his head. One could go around in circles like this all day until one ended up in a chicken and the egg scenario. Avon had too much experience to fall into something like that. 99% of the time, the simplest answer was the right answer. In that case, there would need to be evidence to have him judge otherwise. Yes, Elder. From the last bits of intel we gathered, the Ascension Empire thwarted a sneak attack planned. The attack was coordinated between the Thrusting Skies and Chaotic Water Sector, in addition to the Viola family of the Three Pillar Sector, Earth's main sector. How? Cross-Elder Avon got to the crux of the matter. We have been receiving tips about a potential underground information network spreading through Earth, however we haven't been able to pin them down properly. It was our understanding that this network was crippled after the destruction of the Brazinger, Aderna, Crutus and Lavis families, but it is likely that they were able to survive and be repurposed by the Ascension Empire to be used in this fashion. The fact that Shield Cross Stars had some inkling about the etching metal organization wasn't impossible to accept, but if Lionel had been a fly on the wall, he would have realized where the leak came from. Treasurer Gemsey and the others, 4 of the 8 executives of the etching metal organization, had been exposed by Raylion as having formed ties with the 4 families. It was likely that in forming those ties, it caused a leak in integrity of the organization, thus leaving flaws for others to catch on to. There was a reason Raylion had wanted to maintain tight control over the organization. It was precisely to avoid situations like this one. This result was almost inevitable. However, it wasn't quite yet certain whether this was a good or a bad thing. Such an information network exists? Cross-Elder Avon mumbled. We believe that the reason they've been able to remain so covert is because they're entirely focused on gathering information in Earth's territory. They've never encroached or poked at more powerful families or territories, so they've been very good at cleaning up their tracks and leaving nothing behind. Cross-Elder Avon's gaze narrowed, seemingly thinking of something, but he still waved a hand and had his attendant continued. After the attack was thwarted, the Skies family was infuriated because they suffered the most losses, and they seem to have accused the Chaotic Water Sector of backstabbing them. The information in this space is muddled, but it seemed that the Viola family concluded that a change of tactics was needed, and they swiftly conquered the Rain Galaxy before falling idle for a few days. It was only after that our stations were swiftly destroyed, leaving none alive. They were all attacked at once, and due to strict communication protocols, it was impossible to send back information. Cross-Elder Avon shook his head. This was an inevitable part of covert operations. The various stations were connected to one another, but they didn't connect back to any Shield Cross Stars branches. This was to maintain plausible deniability and the works. However, there is an interesting piece of information here, the attendant suddenly said. Cross-Elder Avon looked up. And what is that? Our technicians observed the final hours of the Rain family once again, and we found multiple attempts at communication. We had stationed one of our covert branches in the Rain Galaxy due to its strategic location, so they were paying close attention to the war while remaining out of the way. They intercepted those signals and reverse-engineered them. What was especially interesting about these signals was that they were targeted toward a relay station, and only then would said relay station send the signal out toward the appropriate location. The first signal was fine, but the second had very unique fluctuations only used by the cloud race. In addition, their destination was the Chaotic Water Sector. The moment Cross-Elder Avon heard this, he stood to his feet violently, the office floor beneath him almost giving out. Send out my order now. I need 3 second star rank fleets. You have 3 hours to prepare. Chapter 1825. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:37 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1825. Happened if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1825 happened to cross Elder Avon. It suddenly all slipped into place. After the Skies family was betrayed, they immediately concluded that someone must have betrayed them. How were they the only ones to suffer while the Viola and Chaotic Water sect had gotten off free? Something felt fishy to them. However, they had no evidence, so they could only roar out in displeasure and rescind their allyship. This was the best they could do. After this, the Viola family realized that it needed to change tactics and chose to conquer the Rain Galaxy swiftly. This was a galaxy right adjacent to the Milky Way. It was both not too close and also not too far from the Ascension Empire. It was the perfect launching pad for war. Not knowing that the Chaotic Water sector had already placed its pawns in the Rain Galaxy, the Viola family attacked swiftly, eradicating them before they could react. At the same time, the Rain Galaxy probably allowed it to happen, thinking that it was part of the plan until it was way too late. In their panic, they sent out help signals, of which some were intercepted by the Viola family. There was trouble here though. The Viola family had designed their signal-catching net to deal with technology of the human domain, but they had no idea how to counter and trap the force arts of the Cloud race. Only Shield Cross Stars and the Void Palace were well informed enough about the technological advances of the other races that they could be confident in snagging all of these signals. Due to this mix-up, the Viola family foolishly believed that they had caught all of the signals, having no idea that they weren't dealing with humans, but were rather dealing with Cloud race technicians. But this was where Shield Cross Stars shot itself in the foot. At the same time that the Viola family was gathering information, so too was Shield Cross Stars gathering information, using far more sophisticated methods. But as the Viola family was intercepting messages, it snagged some of Shield Cross Stars' signals. When the Viola family force artists were decoding these messages, they obviously had no ability to decode the Cloud race force arts, so they instead ended up decoding the force arts of Shield Cross Stars instead. The network of Shield Cross Stars was well encrypted, but that was only in-house. All of the encryption was completed on the back end, but why would they be worried about encryption when they were in the process of intercepting the signals of others? In an irony of ironies, Shield Cross Stars had ended up opening itself up to a breach while trying to breach others. Leading the locations, the Viola family decoded not being the location of the Cloud race members like they should have, but instead the locations of the Shield Cross Stars stations. The Viola family thought that it was targeting the remnants of the Rain family, or more accurately, what remained of its lingering attachments to the Chaotic Water sector. They had wanted to maintain decorum with the sector, so they chose to attack anyway despite knowing that it was likely related to their people. And to their surprise, they actually found people. Not realizing that they had never been attacking the Chaotic Water sector to begin with. It was a shit show, a complete shit show. However, even so, Cross Elder Avon was raring to go. Through this coincidence, they had actually weeded out such a large base of the Cloud race. Under normal circumstances, Shield Cross Stars might choose to bide their time and wait, seeing if more of the Cloud race would expose themselves. But the humiliation caused by the escape of Sulgella, Earth and Windward had caused a huge blow to the prestige of Shield Cross Stars in the eyes of the people. Shield Cross Stars needed a big win, and they needed one now. In fact, Cross Elder Avon moved out personally, wanting to vent some frustration himself as well. Plus, this way, he could absolutely guarantee that there would be no more escapes. He was still entirely oblivious to the fingers pulling at his puppet strings from the shadows. K in recent days, Guerreros had been feeling somewhat anxious. He had reacted to every situation perfectly, and yet things still felt like they were slowly getting out of his control. First, it was the failure of the sneak attack to begin with. He should be in the process of conquering the next half of Earth's territory, after having already stormed through claiming the first 50% in just a single day, but that had failed. The second was the attack on the Rain Galaxy. Although he had nonchalantly allowed the Viola family to take it, he had been carefully rearing that piece for decades already. In fact, his intentions went so far back that he was even part of the first assault on Earth after it entered the fifth dimension. While he used the Rain family and those other galaxies as a cover, he had moved quite a number of pieces in the Milky Way to buy time for the penultimate moment. But the straw that almost broke the camel's back was the Viola family's swift attack on their branches. The Viola had attacked seemingly random places that Greros couldn't ran hickhead Arnie and WHV Thuwanald attack. Ruthy Allen caneld attack the Vinla familva hant at Hikants then at WNNLD make it a vin that he knew which Nlasek Thu channeled have heen attacking instead. Although he had lost exactly 0 men to those attacks, they left him more uneasy than anything else had. It felt like a shadow was slowly wrapping around his neck, and he had no idea what to do about it. The pressure had reached its peak today. His face was entirely drained of blood, and he was even finding it difficult to maintain his human form. Sometimes he found himself almost slipping back to his cloud figure. And then it happened. Boom. Boom, 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 boom. All across the chaotic water sector, the vicious sounds of battle erupted. Shield Cross Star moved with an unquenchable momentum, crushing everything in its path. Chapter 1826. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:37 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1826. Executive if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1826 Executive Greros fell to his knees, watching decades of hard work crumble before him. His face was entirely drained of blood, and his heart was beating so fast he couldn't even feel it any longer. It felt as though everything was coming to an end. He wanted to roar out. Who was it? Who was it that did this? He felt like a scared man, roaring out into the darkness, wanting to know the face of the creature lurking in the shadows ready to pounce on him. He would rather see the ugly mug of a grotesque creature with a maw big enough to swallow his head whole, than to be left in the sheer uncertainty of what might step out from the dark and into the light. However, there was no one coming to him with an answer on a silver platter. He didn't even try to fight back. Shield Cross Stars had actually sent one of those old monsters, and he had lost all sense of propriety. He didn't seem to care about his status at all. He killed fifth-dimensional experts just as easily as he killed seventh-dimensional experts. The suppression of the chaotic water sector seemed to be nothing more than a joke to him. When that man approached, Greros finally couldn't control himself anymore, and his human form crumbled. In his mind, he seemed to see the smirking image of a devilishly handsome young man. No matter how he tried, he couldn't erase that image from his head. No. It couldn't be him. That young man he said was only good at petty tricks couldn't possibly be the reason he was in this state now. The reason he had fallen to the point of not even being able to maintain his disguise, something even a toddler of his race could do. Cross Elder Avon descended from the skies with a bang. When he saw Greros, he was so pleasantly surprised that he roared into the skies with laughter. He had had the faint feeling that someone was leading him by the nose as well, but when he saw Greros, none of that seemed to matter anymore. Since there really was the cloud race in this place, he would take this as a win and nothing less. The cloud race was an odd-looking race indeed, at least by human domain standards. Their faces looked almost like a two-dimensional curved mask, the rest of the volume of their heads being made up by a foggy-like, gray energy reminiscent of clouds gathering on a soon-to-be rainy day. Their eyes were filled by murky white irises that looked like they fit better on the elderly than someone who was as young as Greros. As for the rest of their body, they looked quite human, just lankier and more gray than usual. What made Cross Elder Avon especially happy were the faint runes dancing within the cloud that made up most of the back volume of Greros' head. Those runes, much like the runes of the Rapax, represented a higher noble class of the cloud race. They had definitely caught themselves a good one this time. This was too excellent. Haha. I want to see who dares look down on my Shield Cross Stars now. Avon's voice boomed. Who? Greros managed to mumble out these words. He had never suffered such a loss in his life. Ever since his youth he had been nigh untouchable. He had even come here with all the confidence in the world to force the human race to his knees. And yet, just when he was that close, it all came crumbling down. Who did this to me? How did this happen? Who is responsible? Greris, words ended in a fiendish roar. Avon froze for a moment before he snorted. Did you not hear me say shield cross stars, brat? Listen well, you were apprehended by the protectors of humanity. Ha 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 ha. Greros laughed so hard that his cloud began to rain, sprinkling water falling down. Shield cross stars. You incompetent pieces of trash could never put me in such a state. Avon's expression became somewhat ugly before he chopped down with a hand against Greris' forehead and knocked him unconscious. He would be thoroughly interrogating this lad later, but for now he didn't want to hear such nonsense. Apprehend the rest. Shield cross stars is invincible. Avon's voice roared and the other officers surged forward. Even as he said this, though a hint of doubt crept up in the depths of his eyes. Who was it indeed? *% moans echoed through the room. Lionel pressed Aina down beneath him, his strokes deep and slow as he savored her lips. While he quite enjoyed subduing this little vixen, he enjoyed these slower, more intimate moments as well. He could feel every inch of her body, hear every beat of her heart. Complete an elegant dance between her tongue and his own. This didn't last long though, as Lionel suddenly felt a hand grab his ass. He froze and pulled back, looking down at the pair of moist golden eyes that had a hint of mischievousness in them. Aina squeezed a couple times before pulling back, and releasing a crisp slap. Why do you stop, cowboy? This mistress is not satisfied yet. Giddy up. Lionel was speechless for a long while. Is this what sexual assault feels like? He mumbled after a long while. Aina suddenly sputtered with laughter. What nonsense was this guy talking about while he was inside of her? You do it to me all the time, now you want to complain? Aina asked innocently as though she had been wronged. It's not the same. Lionel replied with great assurance. How is it not the same? Aina asked. Double standards, that's why. If you want to complain, take it to the board of directors. I'll warn you though. I'm in all the executive positions. Aina blinked with a playful light in her eyes, grabbing Lionel's ass with both hands this time to thrust him deeper inside of her. I'd like to see what these executives can do then. You asked for it, Lionel's eyes flashed. Clearly, he hadn't taught this vixen enough of a lesson last time. Aina squealed, but it was already too late for regret. If Greros knew what the enemy of his lifetime was doing while his own life was being entirely ruined, it was hard to say how he'd react. Chapter 1827. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:37 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 1827. Until. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1827 until. Aina laid on her side in the little spoon position, angling a hand back to rest her palm on Lionel's cheek, and seemingly enjoying the kisses that trailed her neck and shoulder. The somewhat dazed look in her eye and the shaking of her legs painted a different sort of story, but unfortunately for her, Lionel had a firm grip on her one raised leg, leaving her no room to run away. At this point, Lionel was certain that she only provoked him like this despite knowing the ending only because she liked it so much. In the end, it hardly felt like he was in control at all, but he still chuckled, finally letting her leg go. The slight shift in position, albeit slow, hit her at a new angle and Aina shivered once more, apparently too tired to do much other than breathe hard. Her twitching caused Lionel to release his own breath, a torrent he had been holding back for a long while rushing forward. Lionel smiled with satisfaction, running a hand up and down Aina's thigh, before trailing up her toned belly and grabbing a nice and soft handful of breast. His hand seemed to have a mind of its own, finding its favorite position without any prompting from him. Are you sure you don't have any work to do? Aina's voice might as well have been a whisper. It seemed that she didn't have much strength to even speak at a normal volume. Lionel laughed. What, are you trying to kick me out after you're done with me? Well, it is a little hot, Aina joked. Who asked you to give off so much heat? Lionel smiled and waved a hand. Suddenly, The two went from on their bed to within the cool waters of their personal bathhouse within the segmented cube. Almost instantly, the two felt refreshed and cleansed at the same time. And Anna hopped up a bit, feeling a strong pinch to her butt. She had just been sitting comfortably, but now she could only glare back toward Lionel, who was already laughing. A small punishment for doubting me. Don't you know how amazing your husband is? Anna snorted before settling the back of her head onto Lionel's cheek again. I still don't see a wedding ring. Plus, it's been almost a month now since we've left this place. I'm a bit worried about Earth and what retaliation it might face. Lionel laughed again. Those guys are too busy scrambling not to lose their lives to attack Earth. Really? Anna asked. Back then, when Hephaestus was flustered and questioning Lionel, Anna could only roll her eyes. This man loved her almost more than anyone else in his life. And yet even for her it felt like pulling teeth to get him to explain anything. Compared to her, Hephaestus was even more out of luck. The others could just cross their fingers and hope that Lionel was competent. Lionel's teammates were already used to this. Lionel went off and did things on his own all too often. Sometimes he would even manipulate them without them being aware of doing exactly what he wanted them to do. When most thought about it, it made little sense. The effort needed to manipulate your enemy and your allies at the same time should have been more than the effort needed just to manipulate the former. But for some reason Lionel almost always insisted on taking the more difficult route. If it wasn't for the fact Lionel had grown up with his brothers since they were toddlers, ever since they were all given their assignment after the gene assessment exam, many might have already felt dissatisfied to the point of never interacting with him again. However, Lionel's teammates saw things differently. The thing was, if Lionel wanted to manipulate a person and have them never find out, it was as easy as breathing. Even to this point, the Viola and Guerreros still had no idea who had put them in such a situation. If Lionel manipulated you, and you knew about it, it was more than 99% likely that he gave you enough information to know about it. And in his own weird way, that meant he liked you and respected you. That day during the championship game all those years ago, when James tried to throw the game for reasons Lionel had still yet to care enough to find out about, was a prime example. James thought he had succeeded in throwing the game, only for Lionel to manage to turn it around anyway. In fact, by that point, Lionel was already over 90% certain of James' intention, and yet he still threw him the ball on purpose. This was all to say that at this point, Anna felt that Lionel was a lost cause, but her curiosity had gotten the best of her this time around. Although the etching metal organization likely had the information she needed, if she went to ask, wouldn't that be like admitting Lionel didn't explain anything to her either? Her gaze suddenly flashed. She really had to rein in this unruly boy some more. Really? Lionel laughed. Would I lie to you? Maybe, maybe not. But what you would definitely do is annoyingly hold back information. Anna slapped Lionel's hands away from her chest. Tell me what happened. Well, I didn't really do much, they just shot themselves in the foot. Who asked them to be so stupid? Anna's lips twitched. She had been by Lionel's side all this time, so she knew that he hadn't taken a step out, nor had he asked anyone for information about what had happened. But he was still so confidently calling those patriarchs who ruled over trillions of people stupid. They're fighting each other? Well, a little bit. But Shield Cross Stars is ironically a nice sword to use. There'll probably be news of the chaotic water sector being annihilated soon. Annihilated? Anna's brows raised. Why's that? And by Shield Cross Stars? How do you manage that? Well, they are members of the Cloud race, so Shield Cross Stars was probably just finally doing its job. Anna blinked. Since when had the chaotic water sector become members of the Cloud race? Lionel chuckled. Remember when they somehow found us in the middle of nowhere and ruined our honeymoon? I've known since then. The human domain didn't have the capability to do that with the precautions I had taken. Also, trying to bait me into killing their prince with a weapon of Shield Cross Stars was really weird, and I couldn't understand why they were so insistent, until Anna was very curious about where Lionel was going with this, until she felt a pair of hands creeping back toward her chest. Anna smiled and shook her head. It was almost like he was taking them as a reward. She would never understand why men were so obsessed with these things. As far as she was concerned, she would prefer her hair to be cut to ear length and her breasts to be about a quarter as large. If those two things happened, her combat prowess would probably rise by another 10%. But so long as Lionel was happy, she would let it slide. Lionel smiled triumphantly as he continued his story. Chapter 1828. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:37 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 1828. Blame yourself if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1828. Blame yourself. Well, there are a few possibilities. I thought about the potential fail-safes the flagship could have. There could be a sudden activation when a human was killed with its abilities. After all, Shield Cross Stars would have a vested interest in making sure their officers weren't corrupt, and an even larger interest in making sure that if their flagships ever ended up in enemy hands, it wouldn't be able to turn against them. Of course, that ability's scope and range would have to be limited, or else there would be too many checks and balances stopping the Shield Cross Stars officers from doing their duty. So the number of humans that could gain such protections would likely be limited to the nobility, which is why he would have to send his son. So it seemed that their patriarch was goading me into attacking and killing his son and his protectors, so that the flagship would shut down and become unusable. At the same time, he would gain the favor and reward that came with not only the return of such a valuable military asset, but also my capture as well. It was a smart plan and the perfect cover. That idiot Richard was the perfect fall guy too. He was useless for everything other than the blood running through his veins. But then I thought of another possibility. The logistics of sacrificing a useless prince for the favor of Shield Cross Stars made perfect sense on the surface, but there were a lot of problems with it. Setting aside the fact that killing your own prince would cause a blow to the prestige of your empire, recapturing the flagship didn't come with any guaranteed benefits either. There was a bounty on my head, but that bounty is chump change in the face of a family on that scale. At the same time, there was no particular bounty for the flagship, so the chaotic water sector was basically essentially just hoping that they would likely get a reward for their service. Doesn't it seem a bit stupid for a patriarch to take such a risk with no real tangible reward? While Lionel's bounty was plentiful to an individual, to a large-scale family or organization, it was practically pennies. What was a mere 10,000 kilograms of seventh dimension, or to people who worked on that scale? That might be enough to run a single high-class city for a few years, but a single family might have hundreds of those cities under their control. This was done on purpose by Shield Cross Stars. They preferred small teams, vigilantes and bounty hunters to chase down criminals. This was so that any prestige that came from capturing such criminals could only be enjoyed on an individual basis. One could imagine the kind of issues Shield Cross Stars might run into if a large organization or family became famous for catching many hard-to-snag criminals. At that point, why should Shield Cross Stars exist? They might as well be replaced by said family or organization instead. Aina nodded faintly to Lionel's words, seemingly seeing a bit of a picture forming, but the logical leaps that remained still seemed too far apart. But then I thought of something else. I learned about the cloud race in the Void Library. They're an interesting race of people indeed. Their brains are amorphous and actually take the shape of real clouds. They're incredibly intelligent as a result because their memories, thoughts and synapses aren't tied down to a physical form, or even a tangible limit. That aside, the cloud race has tiers of nobility a lot like the Raypax, and those tiers manifest in runes that float within their cloud figure, or in other words, their brain. The more concentrated and dense the runes, the higher class they are and the more talented. These runes, however, have one path that they follow, and that's the path of deception and mimicry. The reason the brain capacity of a cloud race member has to be so large is because when they become someone else or pretend to be someone else, they're taking into account thousands, millions, billions, or even trillions of variables all at once depending on their talent and strength. The details don't really matter, but what's important is that when it comes to scanning, understanding, organizing, compartmentalizing, and then spitting out a summary, the cloud race is practically untouchable in this regard. And then I thought about that Captain Vimward fellow who turned out to be a cloud race member, And Captain Urith and Zilgella as well. All three of them had taken the risk to become high-class officers of Shield Cross Stars. You have to wonder why. When I thought to that point, I suddenly thought of something else. What if the entire point was to get the ship to shut down so that they could scan how it worked and reverse-engineered it? What if in the middle of a war, all of human domain's greatest weapons just stopped working because it recognized the death of a cloud figure as a human instead? Aina's eyes widened as she sat up slightly. If what Lionel was saying was correct, didn't that mean he had just saved the human domain from a calamity it didn't even know was coming? Wait, who was to say that he had stopped it? What if there were others of the cloud race on the same mission that had had far more success? Aina calmed down and her gaze narrowed. Wasn't that all just speculation though? You could have been wrong. Lionel laughed. Like I told you at the beginning, the moment they found us, I knew they were members of the cloud race. I only became doubly sure after Vimward, Urith and Zilgella escaped. In my exchange with Vimward, he used a very special movement technique that exposed his race, but he didn't have to do that. In fact, I'm pretty sure he exposed himself on purpose. Why would he do that? Because the cloud race only really has one obvious weakness, Lionel said. And that weakness is that they can't scan a new target unless they release their cloud figure. Aina's head snapped around and looked toward Lionel, who was smiling. You mean? Yeah. The reason they were able to lock onto me and find us in the middle of nowhere is because Vimward likely has a near-perfect replica of me in his cloud figure. A replica he likely passed on to the Patriarch of the Chaotic Water Sector, who then used it to hatch this scheme. Then that means... Lionel nodded, but a cold and domineering light danced within his irises. Since they failed the first time, and even suffered such a severe loss, next time they come, they bring a lot more firepower. And that firepower might not just mean weaponry. Since they failed the first TI deferred such 1 ton time, they'll bring a lot fire PD that fire PI not just Ponry. Aina blinked, the undisguised indifference and confidence in Lionel's eyes making her feel somewhat hot again. Lionel felt something grab him below, and he blinked out of his thoughts, looking toward Alna somewhat speechlessly. Hadn't she just barely been able to speak before? What was with this quick recovery? Don't give me that look, you only have yourself to blame. Aina smiled a toothy smile. Now come please your mistress. Chapter 1829. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:37 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 1829. Casual breakthrough. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1829 Casual breakthrough. Lionel felt very lucky that he had invested so heavily into his vitality. If not for this, there was a chance that he really might not be able to keep up with Aina at all. Luckily, he went from potentially suffering loss after loss to being quite undefeatable. Though, considering Aina's own talents, her recovery was off the charts and almost any little thing he did seemed to trigger her. As far as Lionel was concerned, though, these were good problems to have. If there was anyone in his life that he wanted to please, this future wife of his was near the top of a very, very short list. About a day or so later, Lionel sat in a state of meditation. It was very easy to become complacent without the pressure of the Void Palace constantly barraging him from all sides. If there were any problems with the fact he had been booted prematurely, it was this. He understood his own personality quite well. There was a subtle sort of lazy undertone to everything he did that came from a place of complacency, a place that made it feel like he was constantly looking down on the whole world. But Lionel also knew better than anyone else that he hadn't earned such a complacency yet. Unless he actively suppressed it, he could spend weeks or even months at a time rolling around in bed with Aina without even the slightest worry in the world. Luckily, he had become hyper-aware of this flaw of his for multiple reasons. First, there was Aina by his side. No matter what, she didn't have such complacency. Although she hadn't said anything after learning about Lionel's destruction of the Brazinger family, Lionel knew quite well that this was because they had entered a sort of second honeymoon period of their relationship. Aina probably still felt like what they had was fragile and she wanted to protect it, so rather than complaining about something she likely had a great right to complain about, she suppressed those feelings and directly ignored them. However, It was clear by how much harder she was working every day that it bothered her. Lionel wasn't clueless. In fact, he was hyper-aware of everything around him, and this hyper-awareness only became sharper after he unbound his soul and unleashed his true king's might lineage factor. He understood the ins and outs of Aina's thoughts, maybe more than even she herself did. Back then, while it was true that Aina had been fatigued from helping him bring his body back to 100%, her hatred of the Brazinger family was deep enough that this wouldn't have mattered to her. Logic and emotion were two different things, but one wasn't necessarily more important than the other to most people not named Lionel Morales. The second reason was because of his king's might and the evolution of his dream force, which had allowed him to enter Tier 3. Lionel's increase to his dream force allowed him to be hyper-aware of his own thoughts and the process by which they formed. He had a deeper understanding of why he was the way he was, and what reasons there might be at the root of it all. Ultimately, he knew that if he didn't force himself to work, or external pressure didn't force him, he could easily become complacent. So rather than allowing himself to dictate things, he set a dream counter ability to trigger instead. And now, thanks to that, he was currently in blissful meditation. His mind compared and contrasted the improvements he had made in Dream Force versus the lack of improvement in everything else. He then referenced this with the shifts to his emulation spatial force, and slowly noted down several comprehensions. Thela had made a great deal of improvement back when she was still in possession of this innate node. As such, there were many runes already formed. The formation of her runes were actually much weaker than the formation Lionel had made on his 2 Scarlet Star Force innate nodes. However, Lionel didn't feel like he could take much credit for this at all, considering the circumstances that had led to things being this way in the first place. But what he did realize was that there were subtle shifts in her innate node that weren't in his own. Some parts of the rune were far thicker and denser than other parts that looked to be drawn lighter and more illusory. These seemed to represent parts that she was more familiar with versus parts she had less comprehension about. This was intriguing to Lionel because he had never formed this way. Even for his Dream Force or his Vital Star Force, they either formed or didn't. There was no in-between like this. The question was if the reason was due to his approach, or if it was just a matter of mindset. Lionel did seem like the type of person to not be satisfied with moving on unless he comprehended something entirely. Only then would he use it. This was how things had always been with his weapon forces. This time, however, Lionel didn't feel like he was to blame. There was something deeper going on here. If I'm correct, it's a matter of whether this world can sustain it or not. I have a feeling that if I was in an 8th-dimensional world, forming partial runes like this would be very much possible. In lesser worlds, though, without a perfect comprehension, runes can't form at all. Essentially, the reason why Thela could form partial runes and increase her force manipulation in this way was because her environment could help her to do so. That hypothesis should have about a 97.2% chance of being correct, give or take. Lionel calmly nodded and moved on in his deductions, seemingly not realizing just how groundbreaking this discovery was. If one had an all-or-nothing approach to force manipulation, moving forward would be impossible with sudden enlightenment, like what Lionel had experienced a few weeks ago, or without a reference, like the complete innate node in Lionel's kidney. This would be an inherent weakness of imperfect worlds, or in other words, worlds beneath the 9th dimension. What was even more groundbreaking, though, was the fact that Lionel felt that he could create a workaround based on this. And if he was correct, force manipulation improvement would come as natural to his people as it did for the geniuses of that zone. Chapter 1830. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:37 and 47 seconds AM. Chapter 1830. One condition: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1831 condition: Lionel felt that his deductions simply ran smoother now with the improvement to his dream force. He saw the world with more clarity and could simulate with much greater speed and accuracy. It was as though he had his own personal vast world in his mind, just waiting to be experimented on. He made large leaps with every passing second, and in just a few hours, he had created dozens of potential prototypes for a treasure that could help with this. His favorite iteration was the simplest configuration, relying only on pure force crystals, the mantras he retrieved from the zone, and a life force type jade. The only bottleneck would be Anastasia and her progress in dissecting and deducing the mantras. But outside of that, the gadget was so simple that Lionel could allow the segmented cube to mass-produce them once the blueprint was set. Of course, the result wouldn't be as perfect as a true ninth-dimensional world would be, but it didn't need to be. Even Lionel was much too far away from needing a ninth-dimensional structure to help him along, let alone his brothers and the others. There was something curious about these deductions, though. Logically, even without a ninth-dimensional world, lower-level worlds should at least be able to sustain partial comprehensions on equally as low-leveled runes. But for some reason they could not. There was a deeper sort of imperfection here. But for some reason, even the current Lionel couldn't grasp what it was. Lionel opened his eyes and exhaled. That was enough for now. Anastasia could handle the rest. By the time he was finished with the other things he had to do, the first would be finished, and he should be able to use it immediately with his vital star force. Like that, his speed of comprehension should skyrocket immediately. It's been 3 weeks, Lionel thought with a cold flash in his eyes. He had given the Oryx enough time. Now the two choices before them were all too obvious. Lionel could feel that his tribulation was coming and he didn't know how long he would vanish for. He had to be certain that everything was perfectly lined up before he left because there was no telling what variables might appear in his absence. So, he was entirely serious about eradicating the Oryx if they didn't comply. He would do everything he could to leave Earth in an absolute state of peace before he vanished. But first he would pay a little visit to the thrusting skies sector. He gave Aina, who was meditating not far from him, a kiss on the forehead before he left the segmented cube, and manned the flagship to soar across Earth's territory. K. Alec had been sitting on pins and needles for the last several weeks. While the sectors were in chaos and everyone was ducking, hoping to not be the next ones to be destroyed and wondering how all of this was happening, he was all too clear who was responsible. The young man never raised a single finger. He fought just a single battle and casually strode away after he was done. Right now, he was probably reclining with a woman in his arms, watching the world collapse around him. The thrusting skies sector had taken a small blow after losing so many sixth-dimensional experts, but the Viola family lost several elite seventh-dimensional experts in their sudden ambush attempt, and my more promising sixth-dimensional experts. Even setting aside this, the chaotic water sector got it the worst because not a single aspect of their empire remained. They were wiped out by shield cross stars in just a single day. Seeing these things happen one after another, Alec couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, he even found it difficult for him to breathe properly from day to day. He was tired of people asking him what was wrong, so he just sent away all of his attendants and he sat completely alone in a dining room capable of seating and serving over 300 people at once, and yet he didn't touch any of the food before him at all. Suddenly, Alec stood violently to his feet, snapping his own head around with such force that he quite nearly almost ended his own life. When he saw the young man casually seated on the host chair behind him, a table placed in an elevated position like the medieval dining rooms of old, his face paled completely. He seemed to have entirely forgotten that Lionel was a mere sixth-dimensional existence, and that he should have no need to fear him in a one-on-one battle. Lionel smiled lightly and didn't say anything immediately, only faintly greeting Alec. But to his surprise, the patriarch immediately fell to his knees and slammed his forehead against the ground with such force that the entire room trembled. "I am willing to place the entire strength of the Skies family behind you, Imperial Prince. Whether that be for the coming air wars or anything else you might need us to do. I swear I will do my utmost. I only ask for a path to survival." Lionel blinked a few times. Was he really that scary? He hadn't really been all that cruel in his estimation. He could have made things far worse for the three parties, but in the end he decided to just eradicate the chaotic water sector. As far as he saw it, he had actually been quite nice. Seeing that Lionel didn't answer, Alec didn't dare to look up. He was absolutely subservient to Lionel, his heart having been subdued entirely. Truthfully, this was the best outcome for Lionel. The thrusting skies sector was about as powerful as the chaotic water sector. or at the very least, the chaotic water sector's display to the outside world. They were a seventh-dimensional sector, not quite as good as the constellation families, but not too far away either. Essentially, they were around the upper portions of the middle of the pack when it came to the seventh dimension. They would probably immediately become Lionel's strongest support in terms of raw power. In past years, seventh-dimensional existences couldn't participate in the air wars, but this was obviously thrown out the window considering the heirs themselves were in the seventh dimension now. Once Lionel entered the seventh dimension as well, the heirs' wars would begin, and there would be no escaping such things. Lionel nodded to himself. By the time he entered the seventh dimension, the use of the Umbra, Florer, Midas and Radix families would probably be far more useful to him. But regardless, the Skies family would be a decent smokescreen. Plus, they would be a good sword to use in taking down the Viola family for good. Alright, I accept, Lionel said lightly. Before Alec could be overjoyed though, Lionel spoke again. On one condition. Open up everything to me. I want to know even the deepest held secrets of your family. If you choose to hide anything from me, I will leave and not look back. When we meet again, it'll be during the destruction of your sector. Chapter 1831. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:37 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1831. Everything. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1831. Everything. With Alec's current mental state, he crumbled without much effort on Lionel's part. He didn't even consult the various elders of his family, he simply used his authority as patriarch to directly force them in line. When Lionel saw this, he didn't say anything, but he made a mental note of it. From his analysis, Alec's prestige in the family was high enough to get away with this, but unless there was a change, there would likely be a straw that broke the camel's back later on down the line. The common people could be forced in line like this because they didn't understand what was going on anyway, but the rich, powerful and affluent couldn't be, at least not without tangible evidence and reason for what they were doing. Only Alec was aware of Lionel's fearsomeness, so it made sense for him to bow his head. But while the others trusted Alec, if his choice didn't bear fruit, then the inevitable result was for them to lose respect for Alec as opposed to suddenly coming to trust Lionel. If Alec realized this or not, he didn't seem to acknowledge one way or another. Instead, he did as Lionel demanded and revealed everything about his family, everything from census information to their relationship with surrounding sectors, even down to how many young geniuses they had sent to the Void Palace. In truth, Lionel didn't need any of this information. The Etching Metal organization already had such detailed analysis on every organization, family and business within Earth's borders. However, by cross-referencing them, Lionel was able to tell how truthful Alec was or not. And in the end, there were even a few reveals that even the Etching Metal organization hadn't been aware of. For one, the Thrusting Skies organization had been contacted by the Cloud Race for cooperation. Alec and their family elders hadn't agreed or disagreed, maintaining a neutral sort of stance. This told Lionel something very important. The Cloud Race had methods of contacting various families that were nigh undetectable. In fact, they were so precise that they could even weed out potential spies from other families ahead of time, so that such information would never leak. And that was the second thing Lionel learned. Many of the Skies family's spies had suddenly been weeded out one day, with even a few agents of the Etching Metal organization suffering. If Lionel was correct, this was likely related to the mind-reading abilities of the Cloud Race. How could they perfectly replicate another's identity if they weren't also able to go through and replicate all of their memories? The Cloud Race was likely using this method to gain the trust of many families, all while implanting their own spies. Lionel didn't believe that there weren't any members of the Cloud Race that had remained behind, and as expected, Lionel did find one among the elders, one that was very much against Alec's sudden change. The change caught Alec and the elders off guard, but the battle was equally as abrupt and short. Surrounded from all sides, there was simply nothing the Cloud Race individual could do. In the end, Lionel ended up taking their corpse into a snow globe. He had learned quite a bit about the cloud race through the Void Library, but there was little that could compare to having the real thing in his possession. The last thing of interest that Lionel learned that wasn't part of the etching metal organization's information was actually related to the chaotic water sector. This time, it wasn't due to the organizations missing it, but rather because that sector wasn't within their jurisdiction. As such, they only had some miscellaneous information about it. According to Alec, the cloud race was targeting very key sectors that contain natural resources of note. At first, Lionel was a bit confused by this. The chaotic water sector, at least before the cloud race arrived, was about as powerful as the thrusting skies sector. Both were semi-impressive, but nothing to write home about in the grand scheme. There were dozens of sectors on their level. So why them? The obvious answer was that it was much harder to infiltrate the stronger families, and this was what Lionel had always assumed, until Alec turned his perspective on his head. The chaotic water name, and thrusting skies for that matter, all came about for a reason. The chaotic water sector was known not only for its exceptionally dense water force, but namely a very unique galaxy, known as the chaotic water galaxy, where this thickness reached its apex. In that place, water force was so high in concentration that it suppressed all other things, even to the point that all colors were tinged with a slight hint of blackish blue. The closer you got to the center of this galaxy, the more exaggerated the effects, until you finally did make it to the center, and walking through the air felt like wading through water. The thrusting skies sector had a very special galaxy much like this, but instead for lightning. That was when it clicked for Lionel. The point of this wasn't the resources, at least not in their current state. Rather, the cloud race was interested in monopolizing these resources after Earth's evolution influenced them to evolve themselves. If Lionel was correct, if the Skies family allowed their world spirit to be assimilated by his mother's world spirit, and allowed their heritage to fade, the evolution of their galaxy would skyrocket, and very soon, the resources on hand would become almost too many to spend even in several lifetimes. In a place of such high force concentration of a single kind, just the sheer amount of force and pure force crystals would be mind-boggling, let alone the other natural treasures that might appear. When Lionel got to this point in his thought process, he looked toward Alec. He didn't know why he hadn't thought of it before. If he wanted to assure the loyalty of these families, this was the obvious way to do it. Lionel grinned. This changed everything. Lionel's gaze shifted toward the elders of the Skies family, and they all looked equally as distraught. Many of them even had to be held back by others, but there was clear murderous intention in their eyes while they were looking at Lionel. Lionel hadn't been alive to experience a divided Earth. The only Earth he knew was a single united nation under the Ascension Empire. Skin tone, race, culture, it had never mattered, so Lionel never really thought about it either. This was the first time Lionel was seeing such a visceral reaction related to one's pride in their country and their fellow man. Back on ancient Earth, there were probably any number of smaller nations that may have led better lives by obediently handing the reins over to a large nation. But how many of them chose to do that? How many wanted to do that? Alec was willing to open up his family and show Lionel their everything, but when it came to this decision, one that Lionel felt was a no-brainer, he felt deeply hurt and troubled. Lionel's sharp gaze softened, and his oppressive air cooled somewhat. Still, somewhere deep inside, he felt like there was something he had missed. I remember back when I cleared my first zone and met Uncle Montez. He had said that as one of the first 4 to succeed, I should have received a quarter of the world spirit with a chance to fuse them into one in the future. However, it had already chosen its owner long ago, so I lost that chance forever. It chose. It chose. Could the world spirit be sentient? If that was true, then wouldn't the world spirit have all the same instincts as any other living being? An instinct to survive? An instinct to evolve? And if that was the case, what would be the best way to do that? Wouldn't it be to stoke an undying devotion in the people it served? Lionel felt a slight hint of guilt within. Even he found it difficult to just dismiss these very real emotions that Alec and the others were feeling as the mere manipulations of a semi-sentient spirit. However, at the same time, He had to acknowledge it as part of the equation. The troubling part was that, in practice, the truth didn't matter. No matter what had caused it, the fact was that most people would feel this level of devotion toward their world spirit. The more powerful the world spirit, the more powerful these feelings would likely be. Unless he could find the right combination of circumstances, getting people to give up their world spirits willingly might be an almost impossible task. And Lionel wasn't sure if taking it by force was possible. While he could kill the wielder, the world spirit didn't have to follow him. And given what Lionel knew about them, he wouldn't be able to catch it either. Only if he was a member of the world spirit's world would it follow him so simply. Alec pulled his hand away from his chest and raised it into the air. A mournful cry spread across the thrusting skies sector, and the entire region shook. Within the Ascension Empire, Emperor Fox looked up with an unreadable expression before he suddenly chuckled. Interesting. Chapter 1833. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:37 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1833. Young man, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1833. Young man. Representans of Lionel's light half of the Northern Star lineage factor on my Instagram. Smiley face, at @osbeck__. Lionel left the Skies family in a semi-foul mood. The morning of the Skies people left him with a sour taste in his mouth that he had expected. He seemed to be feeling something beyond him, but it wouldn't be until years from now that Lionel understood where this bitterness was coming from. Much the same way it would be a long while before he understood where his love of Aina came from. In this very same foul mood, Lionel crossed the universe and appeared above the Oryx's territory. The race of people were quite secluded. They lived on just a single planet in a barren solar system, completely out of the way of others. Due to the circumstances, it was almost too easy for them to spot Lionel's arrival. Maybe it was due to his mood, but Lionel even somewhat hoped that the Oryx would resist. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately in most respects, that didn't come to be. Elther's words to his father seemed to have struck a chord. This time, when Lionel stood before the Oryx King, the latter had a hint of respect in his eyes that had never been there before. Even now, the Oryx King couldn't fathom how Lionel had ignored such temptation, but if there was a chance to be taken, it made sense for him to take it on Lionel. The Oryx King didn't expect the conditions to be as smooth sailing as they were in the past. He could understand this concept quite well. However, when Lionel finished laying out his conditions, he still couldn't help but sigh. Most of them were fine, but the final one left the most bitter taste in his mouth. Lionel wanted them all to move to Earth and become official citizens. Once they did that, he would allow bygones to remain bygones. With that move, much of the comfort and calm lives the Oryx had been granted would be over. King Oryx really only had himself to blame for all of this. Lionel had wanted to treat them well, and as one of his own, but what he received in return wasn't the mutual respect he had been expecting. Instead, he found rudeness, indifference, and although it was subtle, mockery. The various Oryx elders were not happy with Lionel's demands at all, but the Oryx King simply raised a hand to stop them all. I will accept your demands so long as my people can have a large city of our own. You can have the entire moon, Lionel said casually. He had recently raised the moon and all of its structures to the ground, but much like the recovery of a seventh-dimensional individual couldn't possibly compare to a third-dimensional one, so too was the case for seventh-dimensional worlds. By now, the moon had already recovered and was once again filled with lush forests and rushing waters. The only unfortunate part was that its wildlife had suffered a blow. Though the most powerful of the land and sea creatures were most definitely still alive. Then I'll thank you in advance, King Oryx said with a slight hint of relief in his tone. This was better than what he had expected, and he had a feeling that Lionel had done things like this on purpose. You all can have half a month to prepare and move out. I will prepare everything in the meantime. The meeting was just as short as the one he had had with the Skies family. At a certain point, when you held enough strength in your hands, things became much easier. In the past, getting people to follow him was like pulling teeth. But now, Lionel had a solid base for himself. one that made him more than confident in facing and dealing with the world. %% as Lionel was beginning to feel much better, and even quite confident. His number of enemies still seemed to be multiplying. This only seemed to be more of the case after Lionel began to assimilate one region after another, displaying efficiency the Ascension Empire had never displayed before, and putting smiles on the faces of the ministers of Earth. In just a week, not only had Lionel assimilated the whole of the Thrusting Skies sector, but within the Three-Pillar sector, over 60% of the galaxies had had their world spirits assimilated with Earth. Of course, the vast majority of this 60% came from the Umbra, Midas, Radix and Flora families, which were considered quite powerful in the Three-Pillar sector. As for the remaining 40%, it was essentially entirely under the control of the Viola family, that suddenly found itself surrounded by enemies from all sides. After this was completed, Lionel had a meeting with his grandfather about allowing some to have Earth citizenship. Lionel never asked his grandfather how he could skip over the 5-generation rule. Nor did Emperor Fox seem to have any intention of explaining, but the two stubborn men surprisingly worked quite well together. Lionel granted the Oryx race full citizenship to Earth. Their current members gained about 50% of the blessings of Earth, while their next generation of children would gain all 100%. Lionel also set aside this blessing for the most loyal members of the Etching Metal organization, although they had yet to come out of seclusion, and also a few select geniuses of the Umbra, Midas, Radix and Flora. All the while, the suffocating pressure Richard and the Viola family were experiencing only increased day after day. Lionel didn't seem to be in a rush to crush Richard at all. His first move had caused the death of many of Richard's elites, and crippled him of his allyships with the Chaotic Water sector and the Thrusting Skies sector. Now Lionel was just silently chipping away at him, sealing off his path to resources, squeezing his business dry, suffocating his lines of communication. Just 2 months after Richard's attempted sneak attack on Earth's territory, he sat in his family's throne room with a tight grip on his armrests. At that moment, the aura of the throne seemed to be far less imposing. He couldn't remember when it had all gone wrong. No, he could. The moment he killed Lionel, it seemed that things hadn't stopped going wrong. Although he didn't want to admit it, he was being outplayed by someone. And no matter how much he hated it, that someone seemed to be Lionel himself. Richard took a breath, controlling his breathing. He had gone through too much to lose like this. Far too much. Richard opened his eyes and someone had appeared before him without even his knowledge. However, he didn't seem surprised by the appearance of this person at all. If Lionel had been there, unlike Richard, he would have been very surprised. That was because the person standing before Richard was none other than Orinik, the very same young man that had overseen his selection on planet Luxnix, and the very same young man who had tried to profit off of his and Aina's death in the Dwarven race zone. What this young man who probably should have been in the Void Palace was doing here of all places was something maybe only he and the unsurprised Richard were aware of. Chapter 1834. Published at 8th of May, 2023, 10:37 and 40 seconds AM. Chapter 1834. Endure. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1834. Endure. You're here, Richard said lightly. Orinik gently patted down the slight wrinkles in his clothing. He was just as immaculately dressed as dressed, his robes looking like an evolved three-piece suit held together by a few chains of gold and silver. Even so, it didn't feel gaudy or nouveau riche. He carried the air of a refined gentleman, an air that was even sharper than it had been in the past now that he wasn't forced to wear the Void Palace's uniform. Orinik looked much the same as he had in the past, the only difference being that he now had a beard, which was of course perfectly groomed. What was interesting, though, was that his beard had neat strands of silver hair, a nice contrast to his dark skin. This was odd, though, since he didn't seem to have aged at the same rate as Richard. He seemed to be the same youth he was in the past. If I didn't come, wouldn't you have ruined everything? Orinik asked lightly. Richard wasn't enraged by these words, or maybe it just took more than this alone to enrage him. If you can point out to me where I've ruined everything, I would actually very much appreciate it. Even now, I'm not sure where things went wrong, Richard replied. Isn't it obvious to you yet? You've been played. By who? By who else? Lionel Morales. Richard's gaze narrowed and he looked toward Orinik deeply. Explain. He eventually asked. You showed your hand too early. You're not as detached from this as you thought. If you wanted a chance for a sneak attack to work, then you should have let him trample all over you during his visit. There are no information networks that are infallible. If they hadn't been specifically looking for signs of your action because you led them like calves to the river to exactly what they needed, things wouldn't have happened like this. Or at the very least, your losses wouldn't have been so devastating. And how does the destruction of the chaotic water sector fall into all of this? Richard asked. This is something we still don't have the whole picture on, but the information released by Shield Cross Stars should be at least semi-accurate. It's just unlucky. They were destroyed before we could make use of them properly, but this is also a favor to us. The variables in Earth's territory are now at a minimum. Richard's gaze narrowed. You knew that they were of the cloud race. Not completely, but we had our speculations. Regardless, since they weren't part of the cause, they were destined to be destroyed. They were part of the previous world order. They're part of the very system that deserves to be taken down. That Guerrero's character didn't hesitate to sacrifice one of his own sons for the sake of power. What right does he have to be one of us? Orinik's expression was placid, but the sneer seemed to be clear in his voice. Then what do you want to do, exactly? We wait, Orinik said coldly. Very soon, Earth won't be able to deal properly with its own internal struggles. Richard's gaze narrowed. Weren't they destroyed? Those 4 families aren't as simple as they seem. In the Cataclysm Zone, the region I went to was under the control of the Lavis family. There's something very fishy about all of this. Those 4 families might not be human at all. Richard's pupils constricted. Not human? Not human may not be the correct way to say it. They may not be humans of our human domain is a more accurate statement. After saying this, Orinik turned and began to leave. Endure for now. Very soon, you won't have to endure any more enduring. Richard watched as Orinik vanished without a word. He too had heard inklings of those 4 families in the Cataclysm Zone. His assumption had always been that zone was a marker of the end times of the human domain, a zone demarking a future where those 4 families took precedence, a zone where, much like terrain of the path, it was created to give them an opportunity to survive. This assumption seemed perfect to him, especially since the human domain was facing threats from other races. The cloud race had already infiltrated so deeply, and the others were only waiting for their opportunity to pounce. But Orinik's conclusion seemed to be different. Of them all, for some reason, Orinik seemed to he the most mysterious for reasons he couldn't nut his finger on. Although Orinik had come from a family much stronger than the Viola, in the grand scheme of the human domain, they were nothing more than ants, being even weaker than the current thrusting skies sector, or the former chaotic water sector. Even so, upon his return, Orinik had elevated the status of his family even faster than he had. Richard had been convinced that no one could have gained from the Cataclysm generation more than he had, but then he met Orinik. And now, Lionel seemed to have returned with a vengeance and had, according to Orinik, been leading him by the nose. Endure, huh? He had already been enduring for almost 3 decades. Even a few more months wasn't a big deal to him. All he had to do was be ready when the time came. Unfortunately for Richard, Orinik wasn't the only intelligent man in existence. Lionel had known weeks ago that he had yet to destroy those 4 families completely, and he knew what kind of danger they posed. So why would he let Richard survive for longer than he had to? Just when Richard thought that Lionel might try to suffocate him to death, a month later, an all-out war erupted, executing a sneak attack Richard could only dream of. In a single half-night, half of Richard's territory vanished and another quarter was swallowed up as he commanded a tactical retreat. By morning, only the 3-pillar galaxy remained. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.